Welcome to Communications Man. I'm Communications. This is Man. Welcome to the podcast. We've got a special episode for you today. We aren't talking about Hot Pockets or your worst, deepest thoughts. No. This is our first documentary episode. Tommy, would you like to explain?
Yes, yeah. For the past couple of weeks, I've been doing some research into the evolution of D&D as a system, and I am actually really excited to share it with you. For the record, this podcast will probably make more sense to people who've actually played D&D, but if you're just interested in the topic, please stay tuned. There's some legitimately interesting stuff, some backstage drama, and some weird changes that have been made to the rule system over time, since it's gone through 5, technically 6, technically almost 7 different editions over the years, and it's just a legitimately very interesting topic to discuss.
Since this is kind of a breakaway from what we normally do, let me fill you in a little bit. Tommy's done plenty of research. This episode should be much longer than our normal ones, and I'm simply going to stand on the side, ask him questions that I find good for the situation, and we'll do that. So, would you like to start?
Where do you want me to start?
Just with whatever you've got. What's that funny, silly first page got on there?
Oh, so you're saying I should start at the beginning?
Of course. Like, why would you start in the middle?
I could start in the middle. Do you want me to start in the middle?
Do you want to start in the middle? All right,
no.
guys.
No, I don't want to start in the middle. I'd love to start at the beginning.
Okay, then we should probably start
carefully
at the
curated
beginning.
list here. All right. So, role-playing games. They exist.
You play a role.
Do you know why?
Why is that?
Mostly because of Japan, but partially because of D&D.
Mm-hmm.
So RPGs existed in some extent or another as JRPGs, created mostly by our friends in the East. Before video games got very technologically advanced, D&D came about, and it inspired RPG as a genre. It inspired basically every other RPG tabletop game and basically every other RPG video game, including the JRPGs, which very loosely became based off of Dungeons and Dragons. So, I have a question for you.
Okay.
This podcast episode isn't about early JRPGs, it's about D&D. Where do you think D&D started?
From Gary Gygax? In the depths of his mind?
You're right, Gary Gygax. There were others, but Gygax is the only named character I wanted to talk about because there's a bunch of interpersonal drama and like weird business CO shit I wasn't super interested in.
Right. Business stuff, boring stuff.
This is mostly a topic about how D&D has evolved over the years and why certain changes have happened, not the people behind it. Although those people are cool and almost are worthy of an episode in their own right, Gygax is the only named character we're going to be discussing today.
Right.
So he was sitting down at a table, and he was playing a war game, which used to be more common, but it was a fairly prolific hobby in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, where usually middle-aged men would sit around with a bunch of, like, Revolutionary or Civil War miniatures, and they'd have, like, a skirmish or a full-on battle scene set up with, like, bushes and toothpicks and shit, and they would shoot at each other and they would roll dice and one army would beat the other.
Right. Basically, Warhammer without the nerdy part.
Warhammer, but historically accurate.
Indeed.
Well, Gygax was part of making the medieval version of this. So, not the Warhammer, but like medieval accurate combat sim.
Mm-hmm.
And this was called chainmail. That was the name of the system. It was chainmail. And as some alt rules -- joke rules in the back of the book, he put in not so accurate things like here's how a dragon would behave in the game and here's what wizards could do.
Just silly little things.
Yeah, they were put in the back of the book and intended as partially jokes, partially stuff he liked to mess around with. And it became so popular that he was called upon to make Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm. That joke part of the book essentially became the foundation for what we would see as D&D today.
Not quite, actually.
What?
The pamphlet he made after that, Original Dungeons and Dragons, became the foundation for what we see as D&D today. Chainmail was still a war game at heart. It's like there was no leveling up. You would just have a wizard that was, so powerful and he could do so many things. And, here's what dragons look like and here's what they do and here's how many units they cost for your army.
Right. They were medieval flavored, but
it was a war game.
It wasn't built on the same system that D&D is. That's why he made D&D. It's a system that catered towards those fantasy-esque attributes.
Yeah. Before I talk about original D&D, I'd actually like to talk to you a little bit about Gygax, because there are two things that are fairly important to our story. And that is, Gygax was incredibly passionate, but very scattershot about creating this thing he did.
Uh-huh.
So Gygax did it with a bunch of partners. Once again, I really don't want to get into them, but they were cool and legitimately neat people. But something Gygax was known for was just making things. He'd make a campaign setting. He'd make a book about gods and demigods. He'd make another book about adventures in the Far East. He would just write books. He was incredibly passionate about what he did, and his approach to making D&D a better game was incredibly
varied.
Very much so. This actually led to a lot of confusion, and it's part of why advanced D&D became a thing later. Number 2. If I was writing a biography for Gary Gygax, it would be titled The Philosopher, the Gamer, Gygax.
So cringe.
It is, in fact, very cringe. But the guy was deeply philosophical. It's really weird because it started from a very war-gamey, very grindy, very the numbers matter way more than the story. There might not even be a story approach. And it became a very dramatic, very build your character over time, very care about this person kind of endeavor. Mm-hmm. Modeled very much after the journeys seen in Lord of the Rings. So Gygax, in effort to make it easier to roleplay and sort of step into your character, created a ton of deeply philosophical and strange lore about his world. And he often added to it in ways that contradicted later editions. Or in ways that contradicted previous editions, and also later ones. But he was very deeply and philosophically minded, and that's very important to keep in mind. The lore mattered a lot to him, but not so much that he was precious with it, just so much that he wrote a lot of it, and he felt like it was an important part of any D&D game. So, now we come to original Dungeons & Dragons. Now, when you hear Dungeons & Dragons, veteran player of the game as you are, what do you think?
Factual. Yes, as a person who's only played 5th edition, and I think we did, one, at least for me, there was, one time we did 4th?
You played a 1st edition campaign, too, over the summer.
We didn't do that for very long. It kind of fell apart, but it is so much different from the system we are used to today.
We'll
get
to
clunky.
That. We'll get to that. What do you think when you hear Dungeons & Dragons?
When I hear it?
Mm-hmm.
I think of a very interactive tool where, on one hand, the DM gets to create this sprawling story that has unique interactions based off of the players, and the players get to write their own story with unique characters.
And how do you make a character?
Well, you think of a person. You don't think of the class first. You don't think of the race.
Stop.
Hey, you asked me how I built my characters.
Very important. Stop. Class and race was originally the same thing.
No shot.
No, seriously. The original book detailed Fighting Man.
Fighting Man. My favorite class.
Fighting Man. Cleric. Sorry, it wasn't cleric. It was priest. My bad. Magic user.
Very generic.
Elf. Hobbit. And dwarf.
So by that logic...
as their premier classes.
So by that logic, priest is also a race?
Well, so if you
as well as fighter man.
Fighting man was a class, but if you picked it, it was implied that you were a human. with the races being it was modeled after Lord of the Rings. So, like, if you picked a dwarf, you were expected to be stocky fighter man that's a little less skilled with weapons, but has a little more health than the fighting
He's
man.
meant to be the tanky boy.
And if you picked elf, you got access to weapon proficiencies, light armor, and you could cast spells. But it took a really, really long time to level up as an elf.
Right.
Because it costed more experience.
You were a
and
Swiss
gold.
Army knife that required 3 times the XP of a normal knife.
Correct. Yeah, that's basically elf in a nutshell. Original Dungeons and Dragons doesn't have much fanfare. The online audience for it is like the smallest out of any given edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is impressive because we'll talk about editions that were flops, that there's still a dedicated fan base for later on.
Oh, I'm already so
Foreshadowing.
ready for that.
Foreshadowing.
There's an addition in both of our heads. We won't mention it until we get to it, but I think you're thinking what I'm thinking.
Either or, this was original Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
There wasn't a race class system. You didn't pick your character's heritage, like as in elf, human, dwarf. You picked your character's role in the party. And if you were a non-human race, your role was predetermined by said race. So it was implied that basically every dwarf was capable of melee combat, strong and stocky, and couldn't cast spells. And it was implied that every elf was capable of magic to at least some extent, and was very graceful and very swift combatant. All right. Side tangent. I want to talk about someone else. I know I said there's only one named character, but this isn't a character so much as a god.
A god? Okay. So which one?
J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah, okay. He would probably object to being called a god because he was very religious, but the guy was the GOAT.
The GOAT.
Lord of the Rings inspired fantasy works and basically revitalized / created it as a genre just on its own. So it's natural to think that the first fantasy role-playing game is probably very Tolkien-esque. One of the first classes in the game was Hobbit. Hobbits later became a race that got renamed to Halfling because the Tolkien estate sued.
Copyright moment.
Orcs. Orcs are in the public domain, but you fight orcs in D&D because orcs were a force in Lord of the Rings.
They were viewed as bad in that particular media. Taking that inspiration, they're going to be bad in this one.
Correct. Basically, a solid half of early D&D is I'd love to play a game that felt like a Lord of the Rings adventure. So you'll notice there's a huge departure from that in later variations of the game, but early D&D was about half chainmail style wargame, about half Gygax with weird and varied philosophies, and just sort of scattershot, making anything that seemed cool at the time and putting it in his game. And the last third, I don't know why I kept saying half, the last third, Tolkien. Whatever wasn't covered by the first two was covered by Tolkien. And sometimes, like, ideas and concepts Tolkien came up with were the pillars for the game. That's part of why D&D has such a strange deity system. It's because the Silmarillion, great book, awesome book, has a creation story, talks a lot about the gods and how it affects the world as we see it unfold in the Lord of the Rings story. The gods are basically never mentioned in the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings books, but if you've read the Silmarillion, you know that they're always doing things in the background. So there's that. Tolkien, the GOAT. Awesome man, inspired Western fantasy as a genre, basically. Obviously, D&D is going to take some huge, huge chunks of those very, I'm going to say, vital and full ideas and try and put it in its role-playing game, which was, by the way, one of the first, if not the first of its kind. So, after that, after original Dungeons and Dragons, they printed several dungeons and campaign settings for D&D. Now, bear in mind, this was for original D&D. So there are a lot of parts of the game that you and I would think are very commonplace that weren't there yet. The D20 system doesn't show up for a whole 20 years. Oftentimes, people would make checks with percentile dice or by rolling 2d6. Characters would be immediately hostile to certain things because they lost self-control. The DM was sort of expected to be trying to actively kill the players, and much more of an antagonistic kind of role and less of the sort of passive judge he is in modern D&D. Gygax actually created one of the most famous adventures of all time, the Tomb of Horrors, this way. The Tomb of Horrors being notoriously the hardest dungeon ever. And it's that way because he wrote it so that his high-level players with all their awesome magic items would just lose to a bunch of logic puzzles and get teleported naked outside the entrance without any of their magic items.
Right, that dungeon was basically based around just... Doesn't matter what kind of kit your character has, you have to think smart, or you get punished very harshly for it.
And it's...
You can't stat your way out of this one, min-maxer buddy.
Well, min-maxing also isn't a thing yet. Munchkin gameplay also comes in way later. But, high-level characters and very powerful characters did exist. I'll get into why that's such an issue later on, actually. But one of the most, if not the most, impactful part of original Dungeons & Dragons got published as the Greyhawk setting. Now, many people would tell you Forgotten Realms was the most important setting published for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Well, for original Dungeons & Dragons, sorry, Advanced comes later. And I would tell you, yes, you're probably right, because Forgotten Realms serves as sort of the default campaign setting for all D&D in the future. But Greyhawk gave us the dungeon. Now, the dungeon was always part of Dungeons & Dragons. You were supposed to explore this. Usually it was a cavern or a cave of some kind, but it's sometimes a forest. You were supposed to go in and out with loot. You were supposed to, excavate it. A huge part of Dungeons & Dragons was exploring this vast network of whatever and fighting your way through it, trying to get loot out. Because that's how your character would level up. You could spend experience and gold to gain a level with your character. Greyhawk introduced several new things in the dungeon, including giving DMs more trap options, and most importantly and influentially, this is the first time we ever saw the rogue. It was called the Thief then, but interestingly enough, it wasn't actually part of original Dungeons & Dragons. The Thief was a skill monkey that would help guide the party through the dungeon, and also hid and disarmed traps, and was generally a little worse at combat than the fighter, but he made up for that by being clever.
Mm-hmm. Meant to be more of a utilitarian than anything.
Correct.
Outside of combat, pretty sweet. Outside of that...
Well, interestingly enough, due to some confusion in the rules, the Thief could, Spider-Man style climb up walls.
Oh, okay. That sounds about right.
It's a long story, but yeah, no, it was generally accepted that the Thief's role for the party was sort of like the burglar from original Hobbit. And, Bilbo was the party's burglar. He stole things for them. He wasn't good at fighting things.
Yeah.
That was the role the Thief was supposed to fill. Interestingly enough, after that came Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, where we saw the introduction of the most iconic collection of 4 character archetypes we have ever known. In original Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, there were 4 classes. Now we know them today as the Fighter, the Cleric, the Rogue, and the Wizard. However, back then, it was the Fighting Man, or the Fighter, or the Warrior. It was the Priest, who could also be the Cleric, and later on became the Druid too. It was the Magic User, because wizard was sort of a caste of spellcaster. You got that title as you got high enough in spells, that like high enough levels at magic. And the thief. These 4 characters defined RPG roles for the rest of the world forever. Whenever you sit down and play an RPG, these 4 roles of essentially tank, healer, damage dealer, - scoundrel, and lastly, magic user, became the most quintessential RPG roles to exist.
That's kind of the shtick we see today in 5e even. A party, typically at least a 4-person party, consists of one of each of those.
It's actually the most common party on D&D. We know this because the stats for D&D Beyond have come out. Modern day, that is the most common 4-character class options. Interestingly enough, the monk was also there. He was just genuinely the worst at everything, as he was the only character that had a D4 for health, and, you sort of roll for your health as you level up, and the monk's health being even lower than the wizard's somehow.
Kind of fell off.
Yeah. Not to mention, he was supposed to be good at melee combat, but he couldn't really use weapons or wear armor. He could kind of be good at ranged combat, but a fighter with a bow was just usually better.
You could just, play a fighter.
People liked playing the monk for the flavor. Gygax put it in so that people could play like a martial artist, like a wayward, traveling monk, which is why it's called monk.
It would help if you were squishier than the squishiest.
Well, like I said, Gygax was very scattershot in his approach to the game. He was just like, this is how I think the rules would represent this type of character. Fire it off, see what happens. He didn't really care if it was stronger or weaker than the others. Like, generally speaking, the most powerful character in early levels was the fighter. He was just the best at everything. And at higher levels, it was the magic user. But the most popular character was always the thief, even though they were the worst in combat and generally pretty bad out of combat once the spellcaster got access to higher level magic. People just liked playing that kind of character. So he sort of leaned into the, I don't really need game balance. I can just kind of make things, and people will play what they want to play. Because he was approaching it from a wargame perspective, and I think it is better if the character classes match the lore rather than are balanced with each other. Game balance wasn't really a thing back then. Power gaming wasn't really a thing back then. People just played the characters they wanted to play. If they wanted to be Conan the Barbarian and cut everything down and be this unstoppable killing machine, they did. But if they wanted to be Ali Baba, this little scoundrel who no one could catch, they also just did that. The Big Four, as I've nicknamed them, and you can call them too, set the stage for character class ideas going forward. This is also when race became separated from class, so you could be a halfling priest or whatever, but there were limits. So, like, you could only get to a certain level in any given class with any race that wasn't human. Humans were the only race that could get to level 20 in every class.
They're built different.
Yeah, so, like, as I believe as written, dwarves couldn't cast spells or either couldn't get to higher than level 10 magic user in original D&D. And gnomes couldn't get higher than that unless they were illusionists in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Huh.
So it was hard capped by basically your heritage and whatnot. Races also got all these cool extra powers, like elves could detect trapdoors almost psychically based on like how footsteps sounded when they hit the floor. Giving all elves echolocation is kind of a weird thing that fell off in later editions.
I mean, that's kind of a thing that's just carried over throughout the years. Just race traits, all that makes them actually more interesting than just being like, I want to play this character that looks like this.
Now, it's important to understand that Advanced was an alt rule set. It was supposed to exist
for the enthusiast.
Yes, it was for the enthusiast. It was supposed to be separate, but not exclusively better, just more complicated, more customizable than original D&D. People just liked playing Advanced more because it offered a more streamlined rule system, more stuff to do as a player character, and easier rules to understand as a DM. Also, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was the first edition that wasn't just written by Gary Gygax, expecting you to understand what like mass combat rules were. So, like, there were detailed examples of play and the rules and whatnot that made it easier to understand if you were just getting into it, because he was expecting this to be a niche thing like a couple wargamers would pick up, so obviously they'd recognize what rules he was referencing, and it turned out it was not.
Exploded.
Exploded. It did for the time, but you'll find out this is, in fact, the smallest boom D&D has had was its launch. It just gets way more popular from there.
Right.
Alignment was also introduced in the first edition of D&D. Like I said, Gygax was a very philosophical guy, so he wanted to be able to describe to the DM who these NPCs he was writing were with sort of a shorthand. So he was like, okay, if this person is acting exclusively for their own gain and they don't care who they hurt to do it, they're chaotic evil. Or if this person is like a holy warrior of all that is good in this world and will protect rather than kill, even if it kills him, this character is lawful good. And he created this sort of chart of law versus chaos, good versus evil, and you can place your character on the chart when you make it, and also most of the enemies in the game were given an alignment so you'd understand where their philosophy was. So like you read orcs and you're like, oh, chaotic evil, so they're bad at working as a group, but they'll do it because it gets them more food. They're unintelligent, but obviously they're chaotic evil, so like it's going to be very hard for demon orc. Right. Orcs are always going to kill. They're always going to pillage. Dragons are evil. They have varied alignments based on color and hue, but if dragons are always evil, at least of the chromatic variety, then you'll always understand, hey, even though Gygax decided to make his dragons intelligent and spellcastery, they're still very much bad creatures.
They are bad men.
Forces of evil.
Don't screw with them.
Alignment is also the biggest clue we've given that necromancy in D&D is exclusively an evil act, because the dead, even if they're just mindless minions, are always given an evil alignment. They've never been represented as unaligned. So when you hear an edgy Reddit poster about, my necromancer made a bunch of dead guys do all the farm work for this village, so obviously I can't be evil. Well, the alignment chart says you're bringing evil into this world. You're creating an evil creature. So you need to reconcile with that at least a little bit. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to talk about gods and demigods as well as the copyright real quick.
Actually, let's go back to the necromancer thing.
Okay.
One sentence. The ends justify the means.
Right. That's not something a good aligned or a lawfully aligned character would say.
Okay, we're done with that. Continue.
That's a neutral statement or an evil statement.
Funnily enough, I've seen the same Reddit posts, and most of them use that as like the main backbone of their argument. And it's like, yeah, you see, you did something good. It's like, I brought a bunch of food to all these poor people, but you killed all the rich people doing it. So like, is that justified?
Some people could maybe try and flavor that as a chaotic good play, but I believe truthfully...
That's very chaotic, I must say.
Truthfully, I think that's definitely a neutrally or an evil aligned character that we've described. This necromancer that makes a bunch of dead do farm work.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And a huge part of that is they're bringing darkness into the world. Mm-hmm. Okay. Gods, Demigods. This was a book published by Gygax that detailed all the gods in his world, as well as made stat blocks for all of them. In addition to that, he included gods from as many strange mythologies and active religions as he could muster. He fell short of including actual Jesus Christ, but everyone else shows up. This obscure god from Native American culture, he's here. That one Aztec deity that they cut hearts out to, he's here too. Guess who else made an appearance? Fucking Cthulhu.
Very based. Very cool.
He actually got permission to include the Cthulhu mythos in his book, and then because they were making a role-playing system, they sued him for it later. And he was such a small company at the time.
That's pretty cringe, I'm not gonna lie.
He actually needed to publish a version of the book that didn't include it. You can these days buy a gods and demigods book that includes the Cthulhu mythos again, though. So, it came out all right in the end, but everyone showed up. Gygax really loved the idea of including as many options for deities in his books as he possibly could. And it shows. Like, there's some legitimately fun and wacky things in that book. And it is potentially the coolest, I'm going to say old D&D book I'd recommend everyone purchase and read. Even if you're not a D&D player, it's fun to look at. It's cool what he's decided is what, too. Like, Thor is just a fighter that can, like, teleport between planes. And he's not even a level 20 fighter. I think he's like 17 or some shit.
That does bring up something. So a question I have. Obviously, he's got gods from different pantheons and religions, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, like, can we have a mini tier list of, like, which ones are OP and which ones aren't? Like, how does, I don't know, Thor compare to Zeus?
Thor is stronger than Zeus, according to Gygax, because most of the Greek gods were pretty weak. And the reasoning for that was, in Greek mythology, the gods are kind of tied to our plane.
Mm-hmm.
And aside from traveling between Olympus and here, they were, very tied to our plane.
Right.
So it was like, they're not traveling planes. That means they're a lower tier deity because of these rules I set up. So Zeus is weaker than Thor for sure.
Okay. What about kind of like more folklore legends like Baba Yaga?
I don't think Baba Yaga shows up in Gods and Demigods. I could be very wrong. I don't think she makes an appearance because she's a Babala Saga is a character that shows up in a Fiendfolio codex thing in 3rd edition that basically details the politics of hell, because night hags are different than other hags in the sense that they're fae. That they're not fae, they're like demonic and abyssal in nature, and they trade souls rather than the other fae hags doing fae things. And Babala Saga was really good at doing her job or something. I don't know a lot about her, but she's the Baba Yaga stand-in. And I don't think Baba Yaga made an appearance in Gods and Demigods.
I see. Okay. It'd be interesting to just see where they stack up. I'm not expecting you to...
Usually, lower tier gods are represented as high-level player characters with certain godly abilities they have access to just spontaneously.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like just a high-level character with wondrous items that are built into them directly rather than, separate items that they're attuned to.
For sure. That's part of why D&D was so cool. Your character could eventually become stronger than actual gods. Also, the Tolkien estate later sued because he was using hobbits and elves and ents and a bunch of Tolkien original properties.
Tolkien races.
Yeah, Tolkien races, Tolkien lore, Tolkien ideas, and Gygax had to separate all that from his material when Advanced was published. So we lost the ability to make hobbits, and we gained halflings, which have unique lore, and they're like inherently lucky, and they like travel around and whatnot, rather than hobbits, which were very stationary, very peaceful people that definitely didn't have any like supernatural innate luck.
Yeah.
In fact, you could say hobbits in Tolkien's universe were almost supernaturally unlucky.
Certainly agree on that, yeah.
Furthermore, RNG was potentially the harshest mistress of Dungeons and Dragons at this time. Let me tell you how you made a character. You rolled stats down the line. Gygax included several other ways to make a character, but this was by far the most prolific and the most popular way of doing so at the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, did they have point buy?
No.
Didn't have point buy.
You rolled stats down the line.
And that was it. No alternative system.
Correct. If you rolled an 11 in every stat and a high constitution, you had to figure out what you were doing with that character. Wizards with like no intelligence, magic users with like no intelligence basically couldn't cast spells. Priests with no wisdom basically also couldn't cast spells. Certain classes were hard locked. Thieves were really bad at their thief talents, which you rolled with percentile because again the D20 wasn't used for skill checks yet. Mm-hmm. So like you'd start off with like a 15% chance to successfully hide in shadows, and it would be increased by your dexterity. But if your dexterity was low, you'd just be bad at being a thief. So fighters became the go-to if you had a really high strength or if you just had no good stats.
Damn. We got a good today, simply put.
Well, character death was a lot more common and a lot more accepted. Like, your character was supposed to die multiple times over the course of any given campaign. It was almost unheard of to just start from level 1 and just have a character that made it and just survived on every adventure the group went on.
An interesting thing to bring up, and I'm not sure if it should wait till later in this very long episode to discuss, but what has made it so that character death is less acceptable in this current year as opposed to back when Advanced D&D was made?
That was a change that took place in 3rd edition, I'm going to say, because they threw out the death rules that were in 1st and 2nd edition. Mm-hmm. And 3rd edition decided, hey, if you have negative 10 hit points, you're dead, but you can still do things until then, and you were just stationary and whatnot. It made it much harder to die, so people got way more attached to their characters, and also 3rd edition was built with a way more, your characters are protagonists, like, mindset.
Right, it went from, hey, these are random people, to it's coming out a lot more like a storybook, rather than you are picking up the life of a mercenary, or insert other character archetype here.
Right. Yeah. Your characters got a degree of plot armor at level 1 in 3rd edition. And then 4th edition, it became even harder to die, and 5th edition creeped up into even harder to die territory. So it's sort of been a slow creeping thing where enough people in game design didn't like the amount of character deaths that were happening and preferred people to just make their perfect idea of a character and be able to potentially carry that for a campaign depending on difficulty and luck.
Do you think that's a good thing?
Generally, no. Generally, I think player death is probably something that is too rare in D&D these days. I don't think it should ever be as common as it was in 1st edition unless you're specifically running a 1st edition style of campaign where, you know, magic is scarce and adventurers are, like, super necessary and very expendable, and your characters are kind of, like, very much in understanding that I could die at any point, and the players very much understand that they can die at any point. Rather than we're sitting down, we're having a fun game with dice, and you're a wizard who can cast these spells. I think, generally speaking, 5th edition is way too forgiving, and 1st and Advanced and 2nd was way too harsh. 3rd edition seems like it got the balance the closest to correct, but based on what I've seen online, player deaths are not... It's not a popular mechanic in 3rd edition. People really don't like how difficult it is to die at early levels and how... No, they really don't like how difficult it is to die at early levels and how easy it is to die at higher levels. Because that is counterintuitive. If they could flip that balance, I think you'd have potentially the best system. But because 3rd edition, it was negative 10 hit points and you're dead, at early levels, there was more hit points than you had at level 1 for most classes.
Right.
So you were fine. You could just kind of exist. So early level characters had a hard time dying. Higher level characters could die before anyone's turn came about, just because high level monsters, you know, this pit fiend is going to flay you, and then he's going to flay you again, and then he's going to flay you again.
Yeah, they like combo star you, and then you just explode and die.
Exactly. So character death in Dungeons and Dragons has never actually been something that's super balanced or popular. People just kind of exist with what the rules are currently. Probably 3rd edition was the closest to getting it right, but only barely. And there are several problems with it.
Okay.
Lastly, I want to talk about the dungeon and gold as a mechanic before we move on to 2nd edition. So, when you wanted to level up in 1st edition, you needed to take an amount of money out of the dungeon you were exploring, and you needed to have a certain amount of experience, and then you could spend several weeks of downtime to level up. And if you were a magic user, you had to be spending that time to put the spell scrolls you potentially found in the dungeon into your spell book, or you wouldn't get any new spells you could prepare.
Splendid.
It actually made it feel like you were excavating a dungeon. It was very much like a archaeologist style thing. You guys don't just spontaneously get better at doing things because you killed a bunch of things. You'd have to kill a bunch of things, take that money, take the experience you got from killing those things, take it out of the place you killed those things from, spend several in-game resources and several days, maybe even weeks of downtime, and then your character might improve at some things moderately. And you repeated this process several times until your character got to an acceptable level.
Do you think this system is better off left in the age that it was in, or should we have something similar to that right now? Because as it stands in 5th edition, you sleep, and then when you hit a certain XP limit, you level up. And I've noticed, maybe it's just because of the way we play campaigns or whatever, but gold typically isn't actually that important unless your character has a specific drive for it. Do you think having at least some version of that system in new D&D would be better than just the level up in your sleep system?
I think it depends on the player base, mostly. I think it depends on the story you're going for. I have a whole topic once we get to 5th edition about things I don't like about it, and one of the things is just how, I'm going to say, cartoonized the simulation is.
Right.
You know, D&D, at the end of the day, is just a simulation. You play with papers and dice. And 5e, it's very much more like a kid's cartoon. And 1st D is very much like the Walking Dead comics. You know, someone is always dead by the end of a session. People are falling left and right. There's no good decisions. Resources are scarce, and it's hard to improve at anything. And I think depending on group, there are ways you could make it better or worse for your party. I think because D&D is a very casual experience these days, I don't think it would be great in the base book, but as a rules variant, I'd really love it if it was just in the DMG as, hey, your DM might be running this kind of experience where you need to spend time to level up for some more realism or what have you.
Maybe we should do that. Honestly, sounds pretty good.
I think you and I would be the only people down for it, because the last time I tried to run something like that, there was damn near a revolt.
No shot.
For sure.
I wasn't there for that time.
For listeners of the podcast, I am the group's forever DM, and it is
the forever DM.
Honestly a lot of fun. I wouldn't trade
07.
DMing for the world. Although it is cool when I get to be a player sometimes. Alright, we move on to 2nd edition. Now, a lot of people confuse Advanced D&D for 2nd edition, so let me clarify. Original Dungeons & Dragons, 1st edition Dungeons & Dragons, and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons were all Gary Gygax's property.
Yep.
They were all things he actively wrote and took part in. 2nd edition was the first edition that departed from Gary Gygax as head of design. In fact, Gary Gygax wasn't part of the game at this point. He would still advise things
It was his property, but he wasn't actively making creative decisions.
Well, yeah. I don't want to get into the inner politics, but basically,
right. No business stuff boring.
She who will not be named bought the company, wanted to take as much of the evil stuff and sex out of it as she could, and she supervised the company from 2nd edition on to 3.5. So 2nd edition was made specifically to depart this version of D&D from the stuff Gygax had written. Now, that being said, there were some incredibly talented, very passionate, and super cool people that worked on 2nd edition. And even though it left behind a lot of Gygax's legacy, it tried to incorporate as much of it as it could, and a lot of Gygax's honestly very ingenious ideas were still implemented in the system going forward. That being said, they improved a ton of it too. 2nd edition is where we got kits. Do you know what a kit is?
It's a thing that's on your back. It's basically a backpack.
Nope.
Bring a bunch of shit with
You're
you.
thinking of explorers kits and dungeoneers kits. That's wrong. That's not at all what that is.
Well, then what kit are we talking about, Tommy?
When you made your character, you could decide to opt into a kit which was a special thing that gave your character some upsides and some downsides, and a lot of in-lore interactions you could have. Think about it like this. Ranger, which is a class in D&D now, was a kit then for the warrior. As a warrior, you could pick Ranger as your kit and be like, I'm good at living in the forest, I don't have heavy armor proficiency, but I can dual-wield weapons now.
I see. So this was essentially the start of quote-unquote subclasses?
It was the birth of subclasses and archetypes.
Very pog.
It was huge, and there are so many cool and fun ones. They are thoroughly the best part of 2nd edition. If any of you are like D&D fans, I recommend going into the 2nd edition books, which are all in the public domain, by the way. You can just read them online, and just check out all the different strange kits and subclasses that, well, they weren't subclasses then, all the strange kits they added to the game. One of my favorites is the Myrmidon.
Okay.
Which is a word
Never
for...
heard of that.
It's a word for a mercenary lord or like warlord. You're basically like the leader or a high-ranking individual of a mercenary group. And it gives you benefits and like stuff you can do in-game in relation to the group of soldiers you command. And it's all roleplay. You're basically just a fighter. You have all the fighter stuff, but you have a ton of roleplay upsides and roleplay downsides. Just entire paragraphs of things you can do with your mercenary campaign and, like, enemies your mercenary company might have.
Allies they might have, conversely.
Think what you work for, the lord you serve, if you're serving a lord, if you're freelance, what alignment you're probably at, because freelance mercenaries usually err towards neutral because you can be hired by anybody.
Right.
Oh, it's super cool.
That's a pretty cool shtick.
All the wizard archetypes we know of, also kits. So the illusionist kit, very popular, very iconic. The evoker kit, very popular, very iconic. Clerics could be druids now, which forsook metal armor but got the ability to turn into animals. It's super cool. Kits are amazing and probably the best part of the edition. Interestingly enough, we also got the addition of multi and dual casting.
No shot.
So you can take levels in other classes now, and you can also level up 2 classes simultaneously. One of those is reserved exclusively for the human.
Hold on, level up 2 classes simultaneously. What?
Yes, you spend XP to level up both of your classes simultaneously.
That's weird as fuck.
No one has understood it. I looked online, it is even more mysterious than the rules for THAC0. 3rd edition overthrew this idea completely to tell you how widely unpopular and misunderstood a mechanic it was.
Alright. Confusing.
2nd edition also got the most official books released. So basically, 1st edition started off as a collection of pamphlets Gygax published. Eventually it became a book that he published, which is what we know of 1st edition and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. 2nd edition published several books that could have been pamphlets before, but now added tons of lore and new character options and new DM options. One of my favorite weird little books it published was the Psionic and Ninja Player Book.
Oh my god, that was a thing?
That was a book, yeah.
That was a book.
Psionics were widely unpopular in 2nd edition because they worked as you would recognize sorcerers to work now, where your character had to be born a psionic.
2nd edition was wildin'.
So, like, when you made your character, you could roll to see if your character had any latent psychic abilities. And if you did, you would roll how good your psychic abilities are, what you could do with said psychic abilities, and they would work sort of in congruity with your class. It was a bunch of very complicated things.
Okay.
Psionics could also fight other psionics with like a psychic duel mechanic, where there were things like Ego Whip and Tower of Iron Will. But what it would look like to people on the battlefield...
It'd just be 2 dudes staring at each other intensely, going,
and one of them would fall over with a bloody nose or what have you. And this would be happening while initiative was rolled, and D&D combat would still be a
That's
thing.
actually funny as fuck. Can we have something like that happen now?
Probably not. It doesn't favor 5th edition as a rule set very well. It would be funny, though. The last thing I want to talk about 2nd edition, because it's a fairly small and unintrusive blip on D&D's backstory as a whole, and trust me, 3rd edition is a huge can of worms. 3.5, an even bigger one. Very few people talk about 3rd edition in isolation because of how big 3.5 was.
Right.
2nd edition had culture as a story beat. It's super cool. I don't understand why we don't do it anymore. But basically, 2nd edition was the last edition that cared at all about historical accuracy or real-world cultures in its book. If you were a barbarian, you weren't playing Angry Dude. If you picked the barbarian kit, it would be like, so you're specifically playing a character whose personality and class features have been modeled after ancient Gaelic tribes.
Right. That's not how the game works now. Not
You
even
could-
a semblance.
A fighter
in the
kit that
system
exists
now.
as well is the Amazon, which was modeled after that.
Mm-hmm.
So did Cavalier. So did Ninja. There were several classes and class
That were based
kits
off of real life cultures.
that were based off of real life cultures and did a good job of representing the culture.
Through mechanics or like flavor.
For
all
sure.
The good stuff.
You know, if your character was a samurai and wasn't lawful good, you could roll that your character was a ronin. And it talked about what that means in Japanese culture and whatnot. And it was really neat. It sort of existed in this, like, it was generally accepted that D&D took place in, like, a pseudo-European, medieval Europe setting that had a bunch of trade routes open that wouldn't be open in the real world. So there'd just be random misfits from other parts of the world just there. And there were ideas for how those characters would interact with the D&D setting. There were magic users that were completely based on a different culture's idea of what magic was, and they would have the magic user D&D mechanics in addition to that, creating this strange marriage of, you know, some societies had, like, evocation wizards who were the, like, healer and spiritual leader, and they just had access to some weird cleric spells, like they could cure poison, even though they were evoker wizards. Among other really strange and bizarre and very cool, very fun, real-world-esque things. This was done away with after we left 2nd edition for lieu of more generalist characters.
Leans more into the fantasy.
As a side note, I'd like to mention that this 2nd edition was the first time we saw two of D&D's most iconic classes make an appearance as character kits. The Bard was a kit you could pick for Thief that gave you some really, really neat things. And the Barbarian showed up as a reference for a fighter kit. But as I said before, if you wanted to play like a 5e Barbarian in 2nd edition, you'd actually pick the Berserker kit, not the Barbarian kit, because they were different. Because there's the two different things.
Like I said, 2nd edition be wildin'.
It was super fun.
That's weird. We might need to actually just run 2nd edition sometime.
You would hate it.
Probably.
Everyone involved would hate it. 2nd edition wasn't the most popular edition for a reason. There are several flaws with it. Looking back on it, it does look really cool, though.
It does. We can get a taste of it once and then realize this was a mistake.
So, we're about to move on to potentially the biggest part of this discussion. And that is 3rd edition. And do you want to guess what the biggest part about 3rd edition is?
Honestly, no, because it could be a million different things.
Okay,
I don't know 3rd edition very well.
I'll tell you what the biggest thing about 3rd edition is.
Is it a D20?
It's the D20.
Shit, I guessed that right, and I didn't even look at your sheet.
Right.
Totally.
I believe you.
Let's talk about the D20.
So, the D20 became the go-to thing you roll when you attack with any weapon, when you perform any action, or when you do any skill in 3rd edition. It basically took what was a bunch of different die rolls that would require incredibly different situations to use, like most charisma checks were based on first impressions, which were based on a 2d6 roll that the DM would make in private, based on how well you're perceived by a group.
I could see why they just kind of crammed all the rolls into a d20 because, like, I run 5th edition campaigns as a separate, like, DM. I'm not a forever DM, like yours truly here. But
I am truly.
I have a bunch of new players. We've been running it for a couple years, and they still forget what they need to add to their modifiers. I'm sure if I had to tell them, hey, to do anything, you have to remember a specific amount of dice you need to roll and what kind, their heads might actually explode.
Well, the d20 was a huge nerf for the thief because they would roll percentile dice, and they had a for sure percentage on how like accurate they would be with their skill check and how good they'd be at like hiding in shadows.
I'm sure there were some unseen nerfs and buffs to adding the d20, but overall, I think that's a good move.
The biggest complaint about the system is it took so much realism from the game. So much nuance was just immediately lost, killed, butchered, and buried 10 feet under. Suddenly, anyone had a 1 in 20 chance of succeeding at basically anything they attempted. I actually used the Wayback Machine and read some articles people wrote around when 3rd edition was published online. There were some old blogs and forums and whatnot, and the biggest complaints were like, the wizard with 6 strength restrained this guy. This wouldn't have been possible in 1st or 2nd edition because there were hard rules for how characters with way low strength interacted with characters that had higher strength. But with the D20 rules, there's like a 25% chance he succeeds at that, and he succeeded at that. There were talks about characters breaking the professions rules because, like, if they had enough materials, they would just try until they for sure succeeded, even with a profession they weren't very good at. So, like, this one post I read was like, this dwarf wanted to be a jeweler, but he didn't have the right stats for it, and he didn't spend skill points to get very good at a jeweler's kit. So what he did was, once he had a bunch of money, he just bought enough materials to keep trying until he succeeded. And because it's the D20 system, he succeeded eventually.
I feel like that one, at least that specific situation, is kind of on the DM. You could just say, you get a certain amount of tries, but past that, you're not getting this.
Well, I mean, it's not like...
Sorry.
It's not like a huge gripe, but a lot of nuance was lost, and a lot of things.
The like hardcore realists really probably felt bad about that, but like, I could see why. But at the same time, there's so much benefit to just being this one general dice that it's like, you have to recognize that it's also a game, and it makes the game part so much easier that it's like, it's gonna shove some people out, but it probably does more good than it does bad.
I at least partially agree to that particular argument, but the D20 was one of the biggest things for 3rd edition. Do you want to know what else it was?
What?
Okay.
I'm not going to guess this one, because I can't see your sheet again.
When you upgrade consoles, so like when you go from PS3 to PS4,
right?
What's the one thing you care about?
How well it runs?
Nope.
New titles?
Nope.
I don't know what kind of consoles you're buying then. Oh.
Backwards compatibility.
Backwards compatibility? Man, fuck that shit.
You want to be able to play your old games on your new console,
I'll
right?
Just play it on my old console.
Right, but say your old console's busted, or no one's playing 2nd edition anymore.
In that case, I mean, yeah.
Basically, until 3rd edition, every book and pamphlet that was printed for D&D was supposed to be used in any edition. So, like, you could still run a 1st edition D&D adventure, even an original Dungeons & Dragons D&D adventure, with 2nd edition characters. There were all kinds of recommendations later on with how you could adjust certain like dungeons and monster stat blocks to work better for different editions. But they were all backwards compatible with each other. It was all a thriving ecosystem that kind of worked. Original Dungeons & Dragons was designed for casuals, but eventually no one played it because Advanced was just so much better. Advanced was a nuanced system with a bunch of cool things. Second edition introduced kits and subclasses, but a DM could rule for either. And if you wanted to roll up with an original elf from It's Barely Not Chainmail and rock up with a barbarian kit from second edition, you might feel a little underpowered, but it's all
doable.
It's all designed to work in lieu of one another. Like, you can totally do that. It wouldn't be fun. Don't do that, but you could. It's all backwards compatible. Third edition did away with that idea completely. Nothing published in third edition was designed to be run with editions lower than that, and as you'll find out, nothing published in third edition is designed to be run with editions after third edition.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense with the past editions, because the D20, that is so much rule, like, shenanigans. You would have to do so much, like, oh my god, the amount, the design nightmare that would be.
You're misunderstanding, actually.
Why is that? The D20 just warps everything.
Adventures published for first edition still work with 5e.
Well, yeah, but you're not playing the same characters. You're playing them, but they're built off of the 5e system. I'm talking about taking a character that was built from the rules, the fundamentals of D&D first edition, and playing it in third edition.
Right.
It's
no. You're misunderstanding. You're partially misunderstanding. Yes, you're absolutely correct. But the adventures in third edition were also not published to be backwards compatible.
Now, how's that? Because I don't understand that. Adventures should be backwards compatible.
They weren't.
Why not?
They were designed with specific references to specifically third edition exclusive rules, and monster stat blocks were given a lot of feats, which were a big deal in third edition. Basically, everyone got feats. There were monster-only feats. People would have 20 or more feats by the time they got to the end of a campaign. They were a huge way to customize your character, and a little ridiculous if I'm being honest.
20 feats, Jesus. It's like, I think the most you can get in like a normal 5e session is like, what, 5?
If you're a human, yeah, but let's not go into that. No, it's ridiculous just how third edition centric everything is. Like, you'll read a stat block and you'll be like, okay, that's an attack, that's an attack. Here are 6 feats that give it the ability to, like, parry spells and do a bunch of weird things that you can't do in any other edition of D&D. Everything in 3rd edition and 3.5 edition is not designed to interact with any of the other rules. Specifically, if you wanted to run a 3rd edition adventure with 1st edition characters or with 5th edition characters, you would have to rework a huge part of it. But that's not the case for adventures that were published for 1st edition. There's very little on the DM that you would need to paperwork to run a group of 5e or even a group of 3e adventures through a 1st edition dungeon. There's very little work you need to do. There's so much work you need to do to run anyone who's not 3 or 3.5 through a 3rd edition adventure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's honestly a little ridiculous, and
makes sense.
People kind of backlashed at it, but 3rd edition was, well, 3rd edition...
It was literally built different.
3rd edition wasn't the most popular edition of D&D. 3.5 was, so it was booming to such an extent at this point that minor controversy and the fact that a lot of books became not necessarily viable pissed people off, but it didn't cause a boycott, which we'll see later. Side tangent. 3rd edition also specified that it was designed to be used with a battle mat and miniatures, which was a huge departure from previous editions, because even though Gary Gygax was a wargame style dude and always recommended you run on graph paper with pencils and hand-drawn maps, you could totally run it Theater of the Mind style. There was no specific references to squares or movement. You could totally do it in a way that was, freeform.
Yeah.
3rd edition tried to not do that, but Theater of the Mind players persisted because...
Theater of the Mind is so powerful. That's kind of what we do now. I mean, not that hard.
Also, races. An idea created by Gygax was completely abandoned in this edition, which was that race should have any effect on your class. basically, if you're a halfling, you can be level 20 in any class now. It no longer affected multi or dual dual classing either.
Now, what do you think of that decision, actually?
Honestly,
Do you think, because it goes one or two ways. It's realistic that not every race should be able to reach the pinnacle of every class, but at the same time, it's a game, and people should be able to be creative in any sort of outlet.
my thing is, D&D thrives on characters that are the exception to the rule rather than the rule.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are 1,000 elf wizards out there,
Right.
but you don't hear stories about elf wizards that are really cool. You hear stories about orc wizards that are really cool because he modeled the character creation off of Orc Jesus, and he's a cool dude.
Right.
Its exceptions to the rule are where D&D thrives as a system.
Mm-hmm. Those characters are typically, more often than not, the most interesting. So.
Yes, I would encourage that. I do think current D&D should probably punish playing outside the type more, because it feels cooler when you play with constraints, knowing that you're signing up for those constraints.
You're playing on hard mode to
But you
have
signed
more fun
up
with
for it.
Yeah, you knew what you were signing up for.
You knew being an orc wizard would be hard.
You also knew it'd be fun as fuck.
I like that decision, but I wish they had...
You wish there was more punishment for it, but you want it to be open, so you're not hard locked to getting to the end
Yes.
of a certain level track on a class.
For sure. I think it should be totally fine that your character plays against the type.
Mm-hmm.
I think it should be encouraged to play against the type. But I think it should be a set of downgrades that you actively sign up for, rather than just hard locked from it. So I don't like the way 3rd edition did it, but I also don't like the way the other editions have done it so far, so who can say? This is also the birth of D&D cliches. Basically, since 3rd edition and 3.5 are the most popular editions of D&D you've ever seen, if you've ever seen a movie or a show or played a video game based on D&D that references D&D at all, it's probably referencing 3.5. The Horny Bard happened exclusively in 3rd edition tables, I'll bet you, because the Bard referenced prior was like an eloquent scholar who could play the lute. Mm-hmm. The Bard as a scoundrel was born here. The Paladin, who's over-controlling and punishes people for breaking the law, that was a thing as soon as the Paladin was introduced, because he had to be lawful good and he couldn't associate with known evildoers.
Basically, the shtick is a lot of these stereotypes that we see for all of these classes were born from 3rd edition.
For sure. Rolling a critical hit was born here. Critical hits have always been a part of the game. Well, kind of iffy. Critical hits have always been sort of a mechanic. But here, the natural 20 plus a confirmed crit were the two biggest hype moments for most of the characters in the game, that it's a cliche now that rolling a nat 20 on an attack roll is cool. In 3rd edition, you had to roll to confirm crit too, so if you rolled a nat 20, it would just be you automatically hit with the weapon, and if you rolled a nat 20 again, you'd do stupid damage. So you'd have to roll to confirm the crit, but you'd always hit.
Cool. That's pretty cool.
It is pretty neat. This is where most of the cliches and stereotypes about the game came about. This is also where the war game died. D&D as a game where you could take a party of adventurers, send them into a dungeon, and they'd come out and sort of slowly farm the dungeon like archaeologists, and it was sort of a very tactical, very precision-oriented endeavor, kind of died here, in lieu of making the game more freeform and roleplay, and a lot more thought was given into the story and the world, and a lot less into the specific adventures and tombs that they were delving into.
Right.
The Mega Dungeon kind of also died here. Again, these are styles of play that people still did, but the books more supported...
The books didn't support it.
The books more supported big travels throughout the world or the planes, or going through this specific dungeon for a number of sessions, but not the campaign.
It went from farming dungeons to essentially isekai.
Yeah, isekai, Skyrim. You were part of the world. You were traveling the world.
Yep.
You weren't farming a specific part of the world. You usually didn't stay in one spot. This is very much where the war game died.
Oh boy.
This is also where some of my favorite parts of D&D also died. They died with 2nd edition, I'm afraid. And I've titled them The Strange and the Subtle Bits.
Bad ending.
So,
Well, let's go through those then.
So like fighters, if you had an 18 strength as a fighter, you used to roll percentile die to see how exceptional your strength was. And if you got double O's, you're God. You're Mr. Olympia. You can
You're like Giga Chad.
Yes, you can bench a house. You can kick a door. You're just great. If you roll low, you're still better than basically everyone, but not that great when you compare yourself to other professional athletes. Again, you're just not that great. It's not much. You're not much stronger than a thief with an 18 strength and a sword. You still are stronger, notably, just not by much.
I see.
This is where rolling for psionics died. This is where culture as a story beat died. This is where a lot of the more strange and weird bits of D&D died in lieu of making it a more streamlined and immersive role-playing experience with less factors in corner cases and weird phenomena. It focused a lot more on being a world and a lot less on having stuff from our world. It focused a lot more on the characters and a lot less on the characters having henchmen, because that used to be a mechanic in previous editions of D&D. You'd have a fort if you were a fighter, and a number of mercenaries would join your fort eventually if you're a high enough fighter. They'd want to be instructed by you. It's the same thing for wizards and apprentices, and priests would eventually have a church. Rogues would have a thieves guild. That's why thieves guilds are such a huge part of D&D lore, because when you got to a certain rank as a thief, enough other thieves would be like, hey, we need you to teach us, and eventually there'd be a whole shadow network of criminals.
I kind of agree with that, but also part of me disagrees, at least with the character part, because the characters are the main, they are the main note of the story, and you could also just do, all of that mechanical stuff in the background. I do dislike the fact that there's not support for it in the modules, in the books, but...
This is, also the birth of high magic. 3 and 3.5 is where Eberron became a thing, and it is where most of the classes became magic or magic item dependent. It used to be magic was a very subtle and background mechanic in the game, and at higher levels, it became you were a god if you were a wizard, but you worked really fucking hard to get to a high level wizard. Mm-hmm. You'd earn it, and even then, you could run out of prepared spells for the day, and you were like Spider-Man out of web fluid without the super strength, man. You were just fucked.
Right. No gas in the tank. It doesn't matter how high level you are, you're kind of fucked.
But,
right?
Classes that could cast spells became oppressively strong in 3 and 3.5 because you were better at first level than casters had ever been in the history of the game, and you got better by leveling up way faster than classes have ever done that cast spells. Not to mention magic items became more prevalent, and you were supposed to hand them out more regularly to the non-casters so that they could keep up. High magic became what D&D is. It was no longer magic as this subtle thing that worked in the background. It's now the main draw to the game is the magic stuff you can do. And it's really hard still to this day to run a campaign where it's like, I want to run it more Lord of the Rings based, where there's not a whole lot of magic. It's not really in your face. You need to ban more than half the character classes to do that. In 3rd edition, 3.5, 4th, 5th, on ad nauseum to eternity, but in 2nd and 1st edition, you could totally do that.
Do you think it has something to do with just keeping interest in the game, like they juiced magic casters up because
I think
because?
I think it has more to do with it became way more character focused, and they added full-on classes to the game, because remember, 2nd edition was mostly kits, so the actual number of classes was much lower than it is in 3rd edition,
right,
and 3.5. So, as you add more character classes, there's an easier amount of nuance to build with casters than there is with hitty people. You can only have so many flavors of punch, but you can have 1,000 flavors of fireball.
Yeah, that's fair.
This is also where multi and dual classing got overhauled and replaced with a system we're more familiar with, where you can sort of take levels in other classes so long as you're capable of leveling in that class. The DM approves and a bunch of other things. No longer was multi and dual classing a thing that's race dependent and a system that no one really knows or understands. I'm sure there are hardcore aficionados of old edition D&D that know what I'm talking about when I say dual and multi-classing, but trust me, third did it better, even if it's a little iffy. RNG kind of got redefined by the D20 here. So it used to be RNG was the character creation process, how much hit points you'd gain from leveling up, and whether or not you just sucked. Now, RNG is dependent based on the die rolls you make in real time. It used to be you'd roll some dice at the beginning of the game, and that would kind of decide your character's fate going forward. Now you roll some dice as the game continues, and it decides your character's fate. Doesn't matter how good your stats are, you can just be terrible at things if you're not rolling well that day. Doesn't matter how well trained your character is, you're just terrible at things if you're rolling bad that day.
Yeah, I know that experience a little too well sometimes, but there's also the other end where if your character's bad at things and they do way better than they should, that is a thing that can happen. So there's two sides to that coin.
Like I said, RNG became a different kind of mistress from this edition going forward in D&D. Also, I'd like to talk to you about the Prestige class and what we lost.
Prestige classes. Oh.
Yes, basically they were these cool classes you could unlock if you met certain requirements. They'd usually require an alignment. If it was a spell casting class, it'd require you to be able to cast arcane or priestly spells of a certain level. And sometimes it'd require you to do strange things. Like if you were an assassin, it said you needed to kill an innocent person just because you wanted to become a member of the assassins. If you were a summoner, you had to have access to a certain number of creatures you could summon. You know, if you wanted to be any number of strange and cool prestige classes, you would need to meet all these requirements before you could start leveling in what was a different class entirely that usually had between 5 to 10 levels.
Not exactly a subclass, more like an extra credit class, essentially.
To explain it to you in 5e terms, in 5th edition, you get your prestige class level 3 to 17. In 3rd edition, you could qualify your prestige class via a decision you've made sometime between levels 1 and 20. And usually, high-level play was not levels 20, it was levels way past 20, because people would have prestige and multi-classed.
Okay.
We're going to take a pause there, and I'm going to go to the bathroom.
All right. Official pause time. And we're back from break.
All right.
Let's continue.
After talking about prestige classes for a second, I think it's time to talk about 3.5. It's hard to talk about 3rd edition without talking about 3.5, partially because of how huge 3.5 was, and partially because 3rd edition was actually the shortest edition of D&D in D&D's history.
Whack.
Lasting only 3 years before 3.5 came out. Now, 3.5 came out for several reasons, but I want to talk most about the D&D boom. The D&D boom happened at about this time in D&D's history, and it is the most popular it has ever been right there. There's technically more players these days, but there's also more people, and also it's like more widely accepted. D&D as a hobby was the most popular here in 3.5. And it was arguably the most profitable then too, because they published a lot of books for it. Now, 3.5 did a lot of things with the 3rd edition rule set and handbooks. It sort of fixed things. It rebalanced some of the classes, made the rules more comprehensive. It's important to note that 3.5 fixed things. It did not, in fact, streamline them. will experience streamlining of a system later. But for sure 3.5 mostly fixed rules that were broken, changed things that didn't make sense, altered several spells, changed a little bit how multi-classing and prestige classing worked, and added several slews of new material to the game. Also, 3rd edition and 3.5 edition are, I'm going to say, cross-compatible. So, hypothetically, it's fine to run a prestige class from 3rd edition as a 3.5 character.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure most of the prestige classes that were part of 3rd edition did get corrected or just bettered by 3.5 material. It's really hard to know, because the biggest and largest complaint about 3.5 as a whole, over-supplementing. Trevor, do you know how many books are part of D&D right now? 5th edition?
5th edition? Oh, there's so many.
There's not. There's several campaigns.
There's a lot of campaigns.
There's several settings.
That's what I'm saying.
But there's 6 books you need if you want to optimize a character build or just have access to all the races and archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
There are shelves of 3.5 books. They just threw shit at the fan in hopes that it would stick. They had a very laissez-faire style of game design. Just publish books.
I see.
Just publish books. Many books as you can. Publish as many books as you can.
Were any of them necessary?
Several. That's the thing. There were so many good and awesome parts of 3.5.
But they couldn't just stick it all in, 1 or 2 books.
Well, a lot of them needed to be books of their own. Like the Book of Nine Swords is a huge and awesome campaign setting with several cool magic items.
Right, but that's a campaign setting.
The Fiend Folio is a monster manual specifically dedicated to devils and demons. And it talks about the politics of hell and its ongoing war with the Abyss. The Draconomicon was a book all about dragons. Exclusively dragons.
That would make sense.
There were also 6 monster manuals.
That seems a bit overboard. If they're just general monster manuals, kind of a bra moment, I'm not gonna lie. We have... Okay, technically we have more than just one, but there's one monster manual that has plenty enough content in it.
No, God no. The 5e monster manual is a failure of an idea of what a monster manual could be.
There's plenty of monsters in it. I know there could be more, but it to serve a general purpose, it is pretty good.
You're misunderstanding. There are several monsters in it. It's bad at being a monster manual. Let me put it to you this way. If I filled a dungeon with goblins, what does it give me to do that? Does it give me a list of tactics goblins use? Does it offer me stat blocks for the types of traps goblins would set?
No.
Does it give me several versions of goblin stat blocks for here's the more ranged units, here's the more melee ones, here's what the casters are likely to do, here's what the chieftain stats look like?
No, they don't. But they do give you the monster and the stat block.
How much lore about goblins is there? A page?
Not even half a page. I'm gonna be real.
Okay.
I'll give you.
Do you want to know how much lore there is for goblins in D&D?
A lot.
So much.
A lot.
You could easily fill several pages with goblin lore.
In terms
and
of giving
blocks.
you monsters, it does that pretty good.
No.
Lore on the monsters, background on the monsters, not so
We're not
much.
going to get into how bad the 5e monster manual is.
We can in the 5e part.
For sure. Suffice it to say that they made probably way too many books for 3.5. A lot of them don't look necessary from outsider looking in, but a lot of them were very looked forward to. Far into Monster Manual, there was the Monster Manuals. There's one Monster Manual which has a huge section of it dedicated to god-blooded monsters. So if the Gnoll was a chosen of Yiganu, the Gnoll deity that's sort of a overlord of them in the Abyss.
Uh-huh.
The Gnoll has demigod status and is like bigger than the other strange hyena folk around him and like more powerful and has like a death aura and shit. And it's the same way for every evil race and every god they have, and that's just not something they'd ever do in 5e. Like I said, there was a lot of throwing shit at the fan and hoping that it would stick, and a lot of people really disliked that. There wasn't much quality control, but like in every book there's some solid nuggets of just really cool stuff, and they cared a lot more about presenting more options in 3rd edition and 3.5 edition than they do in later editions. 3.5 also killed off D&D Advanced Editions as a concept. So there's Advanced 1st Edition and Advanced 2nd Edition. 3.5 is where Advanced 3rd Edition would go, but it decided to be its own kind of edition instead.
Right.
Which is fair enough, because people basically always exclusively played Advanced Edition once it became an option anyway. I don't think that's a huge loss. I actually kind of like that as like a concept, because it seems easier to keep track of than here's Advanced. It's more like an update.
Right.
Than it is
The
an
patch.
optional rule set.
The big patch.
Yeah, exactly. I guess you can't talk about 3.5 without talking about backwards building and munchkins. Okay. Do you know what a munchkin is?
I honestly no.
Okay, so a munchkin...
I know we played like Munchkins a couple times at Caleb's, and I still didn't understand the rules because I played like twice total.
For those of you listening at home, Munchkins is a card game where you have a D&D style character and you're trying to make that character as powerful as possible, and you compete with other people in the card game. It lasts like a session. It's a pretty fun party game for
It's pretty cool.
super nerds.
It's pretty cool.
So Munchkin is a term that came about in 3.5 because the best races, for sure, in 3.5 was Halfling and Half-Orc.
Okay.
And it was only Half-Orc if you were playing a two-handed fighter or a barbarian. Otherwise, just pick Halfling. Always pick Halfling, because it improves your AC. And makes you lucky and stuff. It was basically just the best race to pick. Always pick a Halfling. So power gamers were nicknamed Munchkins because they were always like yay tall Halflings. And Munchkins, famous from Wizards of Oz.
So the min-maxers became manlets in 3.5.
Correct. And that's where Munchkin comes as a term.
I see.
Basically, 3.5 had so much material and so many ways to break the system. If you wanted to play a character that was even a little viable, you had to make your character at level 20 and remove 19 levels from it.
Okay.
And that's what backwards building is. So the system was kind of designed with the idea that you would like pick your character's prestige class if you happened to fit it as you were leveling up, and you could kind of level into that, or maybe you'd try and get feats and features that would give you the ability to prestige class as you leveled up. It was sort of in playtest, I'd assume they were like, it's going to be freeform, it's going to be great, it's going to be cool, they'll discover their character as they level up. But instead, the same thing that happens in 5th edition happened way worse, where people would pick their archetype prestige classes, multi-classes, all at level 1. And they just build themselves into whatever character they envisioned, because if they didn't do it like that, their character couldn't keep pace with the other characters who do that. This was also a point in D&D's history where casters were potentially the most overpowered that they've been, because concentration wasn't a mechanic at all.
Yep.
So casters could concentrate on an infinite number of spells, and since casters were more powerful at level 1 than they used to be, it's not like there was a sort of a bell curve where other classes were better and then casters eventually got better via logical world building. It was just casters are better at doing everything except having hit points, but they're even better at healing those hit points or protecting those hit points. So have fun being a bag of hit points. I'm going to fly over there with invisibility and blur cast on myself and throw fireballs
You be
down.
the punching bag. I will be the main protagonist. Thank you.
3.5, huge huge edition. Several topics. Honestly, we could make a whole podcast episode about just the books that came out in 3.5. Probably several hours of content can be farmed just discussing and reacting to the titles and blurbs for each book that came out in 3.5.
Do you have the 3.5 books? We can farm it if you want.
I don't.
Damn.
I am not.
We'll make this a long-term goal. We'll farm in like the 30th episode range.
Please don't make promises like that.
I don't think we're gonna have all the books by then, but we might do that. We'll think about it.
Because of the original license agreement, 3.5 is still technically published under the public domain. You can get them non-pirated online.
Right.
So if we wanted to, we could go to the compendium of 3.5 and just start farming content someday.
That is factual. But think about this. The actual physical book, easily better than some digital free copy.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Okay.
3.5. It's doing 3.5 things. It's the most popular edition of D&D, maybe ever, but at the moment, it is so huge. It's getting new players interested in the game. It's reinvigorating interest from old players. It's the most cool and hot on the block topic to talk about.
Uh-huh.
How do you think Wizards of the Coast fucks it up?
By making 4th?
You're correct. Wizards of the Coast did make 4th edition.
Dive bomb.
But they also didn't own 3.5.
Oh, so is Wizards of the Coast getting involved?
Wizards of the Coast buys D&D. After it goes under, becomes way less profitable. It becomes way less profitable because of overpublishing. So, Wizards bought it sometime between 2nd and 3rd edition. 3.5 starts fading from popularity, and they start doing some things. One of the overpublishers that they had contracted, so people who were making way too much content for the game, was a company called Paizo. Wizards was like, Paizo, go fuck yourself. We don't need your content anymore. We're making this 4th edition D&D. It's going to be like 3.5, but with blackjack and hookers. Everyone will love it.
Splendid.
You know what Paizo did?
What?
Paizo had a bunch of unpublished D&D adventures. And D&D has this cool thing called the original license agreement, which basically says you're totally okay to make content for this game. You can publish it, you can sell it, you can do whatever you'd like, but, there's certain copyright laws you gotta stick to. You can't say it's endorsed by, you can't make it officially part of the canon, but you can publish it if you'd like.
Yeah.
So, between the OGL and the leftover magazines, Paizo was like, I know what we're gonna do. We're gonna make our own edition of D&D, but also with blackjack and hookers.
This is fantastic. This is one of the best story arcs I've ever heard of.
So around the same time, 3rd edition was falling off. 3.5 edition was falling off due to just too much material being published and Wizards wanting to make something new, because every time there's a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, there's an increase in revenue.
Right.
These people at Paizo were making Pathfinder.
Pathfinder.
Now, I'd like to take a side tangent here, and I want to talk to you about Unearthed Arcana, not the articles that Wizards publishes these days, but the magazines, and also Dragon Magazine. Do you know what these are?
No.
So, D&D used to have several ongoing magazines, which were endorsed by them and paid for by them, that would expound upon the rules for the game, add content to the game, and even create adventures, one-offs, or entire campaigns for the game. And they'd be published in magazines and given to weekly subscriptions, the same way magazines work these days. Interestingly enough, there are a bunch of very talented people and an incredible amount of lore, which is now just fully canon in D&D that came from these magazines. If you ever want to dive into the deep workings of the game, just start reading the Dragon magazines or Unearthed Arcana.
Okay. Never knew these existed up until now, but cool.
Yeah, there are several things that came from Dragon magazine that just became a mainstay in D&D. Arguably, D&D started from Dragon magazines and Unearthed Arcana style pamphlets and eventually became books, but that's a story for another day. Basically, Pathfinder was made from these magazine authors being told to go fuck themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 4E was coming out at about the same time Pathfinder did. Pathfinder came out after 4E, and it was marketed as sort of a true successor to 3rd edition, because everybody hated 4th edition.
So bad.
We're about to talk about 4th edition. But before we do, I wanted to briefly touch on Pathfinder. One last point I'd like to bring up about Pathfinder is it fell off about 2014, 2015. It used to be more popular than D&D. When D&D was pushing 4th edition and stopped publishing for 3.5, Pathfinder came out, and it was marketed as 3.5 but better, and it kind of was, and kind of still is.
Yeah.
But the reason it fell off around then was when 5th edition came out.
Before we can talk about 5th edition, we got to talk about 4th, though.
4th edition.
The black horse of it all.
More like the red-headed stepchild, actually. 4th edition is pretty much universally shat on as the worst edition of D&D, which I think it deserves.
Kind of, just a little.
I think it for sure deserves, but I don't think it's... A lot of people are like, okay, 1st edition, A tier, 2nd edition, A tier, 3.5, S plus tier, 5th edition, S plus, triple max tier, 4th edition, negative F tier. It's more like... So, every edition of D&D sort of applies to a certain type of D&D player more. I think I like 2nd edition more, but if it had the D20 mechanic, I think a lot of people still like 1st edition more. I think the most players like 3.5 edition more, and they play 5th edition because it's the most popular. Yeah. I think all the normies like 5th edition more. And I think all the power gamers and World of Warcraft players like 4th edition more.
4th edition is like, what if we took D&D and made it like Vibio game?
Very similar, yeah. I'm actually going to go over that. That's one of my topics. But first, the most important thing about 4th edition was just how much bad will was created when it was published, because they had been shitting out 3.5 books for several years at this point. The power creep was so ridiculous, the quality control was so bad, and the sheer volumes of books was just so dense that abandoning that entirely, scrapping it, creating a system overhaul the same way they did for 2nd edition, and creating a 4th edition, created a ton of bad will with both the game stores and the general community. So 4th edition was sort of doomed to fail. Even if it was the best RPG in existence, people would still probably not get into it out of spite. And unfortunately for 4th edition,
it was also just bad.
Well,
did not exactly help it.
It was not the best. There are upsides. I'm actually going to talk about some of them, because 4th edition, as a rule set, isn't the worst thing in the world. I've certainly looked at way worse RPGs, and I started playing in 4th edition, mind you.
Yeah. I think when you compare it to the other D&D versions, it's certainly barely crawling in the back.
Well, I mean, basically every D&D player who's worth their salt would for sure play 4th edition over original Dungeons & Dragons, just because that game system is so confused and relies on mechanics that aren't even referenced in the base material for the games. You need to know how to play chainmail, and to know how to play chainmail, you need to know how to play weird war games that your dad's or your grandpa's play sometimes.
See, I want to disagree out of spite, but yeah, fourth edition is closer to what we're used to and more of what's actually official D&D as opposed to that weird mess that original D&D was. So I'll give it that, but it's
Honestly,
still bad.
I think your idea of fourth edition has been poisoned a little bit. But after talking about the bad will for the community, I do want to talk a little bit about the lore. Because fun fact, D&D has an ongoing narrative that changes based on editions of the game and was started by yours truly, the gamer philosopher himself, Gary Gygax.
Funny man.
The funny man. Fourth edition overhauled that lore and full on destroyed so much of it. The in-game explanation for why that is this thing called the Spell Plague, where basically magic went on the fritz and it killed a bunch of gods and erased a bunch of things from the timeline and destroyed a bunch of cities, created a bunch of new races. It's a very strange mess, but basically 4th edition lore takes place after the Spell Plague and is designed to sort of be post-apocalyptic Gygax world, and a lot of people were just not fans of just how poorly the lore that they had been following since 1st edition and on into 3.5 was treated, because it felt like they just overhauled it to put in a bunch of new ideas they had, and a lot of people weren't down for that.
See? Spell Plague. Sounds familiar, you remember the mending from MTG?
Yeah.
Where it didn't exactly have to happen, The mending didn't have to happen for the story to, go on.
Yeah, for those of you who are unfamiliar, MTG has these, very powerful characters that are planeswalkers, and the mending changed how planeswalkers function, and it sort of messed with the hard magic system that was in Magic the Gathering before. And yeah, it was a lot like that. The thing is, the mending was generally looked upon as a kind of good decision to make it so that characters were less godly.
It's kind of a way to, I won't say it was a perfect fix to the whole OP Planeswalker situation. We had Sorin, we had, I think Nahiri was an Oldswalker too.
Nahiri was not an Oldswalker, no.
I thought Nahiri, at least she was close. She was battling Sorin. Anyways, that's off subject.
Way off
we
subject.
could talk about magic lore later. Basically, the mending fixed the OP power creep of these old walkers, so they were similar in power to the planeswalkers that we got used to in the current story.
For sure.
This is kind of the same effect, except there isn't exactly a reason as to why.
Well, they wanted to change how magic worked. They wanted to change how magic items worked. They wanted to change a bunch of fundamentals of the game. They wanted to change the gods roster. They wanted to change how many gods were in a campaign setting. They wanted to completely rewrite half the monster's lore. And this was met with mixed results. Some people still ridicule 4th edition for this Spell Plague. Some people think it was a good idea. Some people, myself included, were introduced to the game with the weird post-Spell Plague lore, and really enjoy some parts of it and think some parts of it are very stupid. I personally think if you're a DM, you should be cherry-picking the lore anyway, and 4th edition has a lot of good lore to offer, so you can take what you'd like and leave what you don't. Personally, I really love Gygax's ongoing narrative, and like to pretend the Spell Plague was never a thing that was mentioned. I also like to reference some stuff that's in 4th edition that just seems cooler than what's being talked about before. They added a bunch of neat ideas that are still part of the game. But most of the ideas were also considered bad because most of 4th edition was bad. So, here we are. The rules system, got completely overhauled too. D20 was still the main mechanic, so I guess that stuck. There are still 6 ability scores. That also stuck. Health works differently now. You don't roll for it exactly. You have starting health and health improvements as you level up, which is kind of a flat number. Point buy was introduced in 3rd and 3.5, also 2nd, I think, but probably not. I didn't see anything about point buy in 2nd, but I know people have been talking about it before 3rd, so it was probably in some supplemental material or
quote unquote like 2.5 maybe.
It was an alt rule, probably added sometime in advanced 2nd edition that I just didn't find in my research.
Yeah.
But point buy as a system was the preferred in 4th, which is unheard of in D&D because it was still roll up until that point. A lot of people like point buy more than rolled stats, which is why it's the primary function in 5th edition too. They just fixed and changed and altered so much, and I say fixed because they did change and correct some things in a good direction, but that's like such a minority in comparison with everything that they just broke.
Right. The diamonds in the rough are just too small to find amidst the enormous amount of rough.
They also made the mistake of overpublishing 4th edition too. So there are a lot of 4th edition player handbooks. I think there are 4 or 5, not including the 4.5 edition players handbooks that came out later. There are several monster manuals, Draconomicons, a Dungeon Master's Guide, alongside a rule compendium, as if those things are separate.
Weird. Okay.
Just several strange and obscure decisions were made.
Rules compendium. Why wouldn't you just put the rules in the books? Like,
the rules are in the books, but they were so confusing, and
they needed a book to explain the other book's rules.
A huge complaint about 4th edition in general was the density of the 4E system.
Silly, dubious little guys.
Now, don't get me wrong. There are some solid advocates and fans of 4E, and they're right to be fans of 4E because it's kind of the rebirth of the war game. The war game that was killed and dead and buried in 3rd edition sort of came back. It was suddenly more tactical and streamlined. So you have a bunch of players of 4th edition who aren't in it for the roleplay or the ongoing narrative. They just picked up a system that meshes in the cogs of their brain the same way you or I play Magic the Gathering, and they look at it and play it kind of like that. Where they build characters that way, and sometimes there's a narrative and sometimes there's not, and it's very wargamey for them. It's a very clean and clinical system that a lot of people really like. A lot of people meaning several thousand. Mm-hmm. The majority of the D&D fan base, however, kind of finds it video gamey, which is funny because D&D inspired video games, and then 4th edition is sort of an example of art Ouroboros style eating itself.
Yeah.
Because suddenly we have an edition of D&D based partially or at least modeled after video games, where like suddenly there are encounter powers which recharge when you roll initiative, not when you take a rest of any kind. There are at-will abilities that are just, they're sort of like cantrips. You'd recognize them as cantrips that spellcasters use, but every character has access to a ton of them that you can just always use, and they're usually better basic attacks or movement abilities. But you're only designed to use them in combat, because when you use any of the movement abilities as like utility abilities out of combat, they're kind of weird. Skill checks are replaced with skill challenges, which are these weird gauntlet decision flowchart trees that I've never been able to make much sense out of.
I'm really glad I didn't get introduced into 4E.
It's a very interesting system. It's kind of a battle sim. It's much more a battle sim than a role-playing game. There's definitely a huge focus on combat. My biggest complaint, and most people's biggest complaint about 4th edition, aside from the video gaminess and the density of the system and how much just general bad will was created when it was published, is everyone does everything. So it's all flavor, which doesn't count for much because you forgot the role-playing part of your role-playing game. There are arcane healers. There are martial healers. there's a tag under those classes saying what those classes are good at. So if that's healing, then they're called a leader. If that's tanking, they're called a brute, I think. If that's dealing a bunch of damage and weaving between guys, they're called a skirmisher. There's a little tag. They're called a striker. Skirmisher is the monster version. There's a little tag under the character class for what that class is good at. And eventually, it's just like every kind of character can do basically everything. You have a warlord, which is basically a fighter, but he can heal the same way a bard or a cleric can, sheerly by inspiring people. So he's a non-magical healer that can just res you if you have 0 hit points.
I see.
And there are melee arcane fighters that are just as good as fighters, but because the only difference between them are like damage types and the flavor of the character, and since they've eliminated a huge part of role-playing as a mechanic from 4th edition, it really just feels like you're building whatever number crunchy thing tickles your fantasy more so than an actual character. And there are just so many characters and so many classes, and they're also video gamey and very much based on popular RPGs at the time. It's such a strange system to get your head around. Not to mention, they also put multi-classing in this game. So you can be 2 or more classes of these strange video gamey classes, and it gives weird rules that are easy to break if you take the right classes.
I think the shtick we're getting at here is that, variance is a good thing, and being able to build a character in a non-conventional way is cool. 4E did that a bit too much, it sounds like.
For sure.
You can kind of just be literally everything, like you said, and that's a real problem when it comes to role-playing, because then everyone's kind of the same, in a sense. It's just kind of sounds like ESO in a sense, almost.
It really is.
ESO, you can kind of just, I'm going to be everything.
It really is similar, but it's more like, it's harder to be everything because it is still party-based at the end of the day. It's more like you can pick any origin and do anything you want with it. It's like if you want to be an arcane healer, that's possible. If you want to be a martial healer, that's also possible. If you want to be a divine damage dealer, also possible. Your party's stealth unit could just as easily be a high-level, what we would call cleric, as well as a rogue. Everything is so cross-compatible with each other as far as like classes and what they can do go. It makes it feel very much like no one power source or one type of character is really better at anything than any other type of character. You're just sort of picking whatever you want to do.
Okay.
I do want to talk about, there are some good apples in the pit of bad ones. And one of them is that 4th edition is the first edition, since actually 1st edition, to focus on the DM more than the players when it comes to publishing material. So, like, I still own a 4th edition Monster Vault. And the Monster Vault is sort of, they took a bunch of different monsters that were very popular from the, like, 6 monster manuals they created, and they put it in the Monster Vault, alongside a tactics chart and several deep and very intricate descriptions of those monsters' lore.
It's honestly kind of cool as fuck. I wish 5e had that.
The Monster Vault didn't have a huge selection of monsters, and there were several very iconic monsters that it didn't include, but the monsters that it did include, you felt like you knew everything about the monster after reading several passages on it. There's way more flavor and lore and way cooler stuff and way more stat block variants than there is in 5th edition, and even some of the 3.5 and 3rd edition monster books. Despite the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Rules Compendium being separate books in 4th edition, they're both very clearly written with the DM in mind. Like, in 5th edition, it feels like half the DMG belongs to the players because it's rewarding the players, and here's magic items and boons and several things with like
stuff to give your players.
And there's like 5 pages dedicated to world building. Like, the Dungeon Master's Guide is very much built for, here's the player's stuff in 5e.
Your stuff? Figure it out, buddy boy, pal friendo.
In 4th edition, it wasn't like that. It was very much published with DM intentions. I think part of that comes from the video gamey aspect of it, but it was a good part of the video gamey aspect. Mm-hmm. They were like, okay, the DM basically has to be the computer. Let's make sure the computer has...
It doesn't just bug out randomly because we didn't give them enough info.
Exactly. And it's...
Honestly, kind of wish I could at least keep that part of 4E.
There are several good apples in the pit of bad ones. And like I said, a lot of people really love 4E as a system because it's very clinical and tactical as a gaming system. A lot of power gamers and war gamers like playing it more than 3.5 because it's harder to break and easier to run combat sessions. That being said, I just offended a ton of people because they have like a decade of experience or more playing 3.5, so they're like, oh, the combat system's so intuitive, and oh, it's not hard to break 3.5, you just aren't used to the system. There's a meta. To which I'd say they proved my point.
Yeah.
4E is such a mixed bag. The issue is the bag is also filled with shit.
It's like you've got your Halloween bucket, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a mix between Milk Duds and Crunch Bars, and the ratio is like 80% Milk Duds to 20% Crunch Bars.
Oh, jeez.
And also the top of the Halloween bag is
Almond Joys.
Oh, no. Oh, my God. Also, there's a razor blade just somewhere in there, and you don't know where it is.
That razor blade has Spell Plague engraved on it.
I think this is the best way to make a physical example of what 4E is. That's what we're going to consider it from now on.
Okay. So, let me set the stage for you. Pathfinder, dominating the market. 4E, very much a failure. Wizards of the Coast, buckles down. Decides D&D is one of our most iconic properties. We've made movies based on it. We've made TV shows based on it. They haven't. Those were both Gygax. But Dungeons & Dragons, iconic. Huge part of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. We need to revitalize it for the 2020s, for the 20-teens. Mm-hmm. We need to compete with Pathfinder, who are those people we told to go fuck themselves a minute ago.
There are problems.
We need to get our market back. What the fuck were we doing with 4th edition? Why did everyone hate it so much? They asked one of the lead designers for 4th edition, and that lead designer's friends, and another guy they hired on for game design.
The 4 people they had for game design.
They had way more than 4 people. The main 2 were Jeremy Crawford and Mike Merles. The main 2 were Jeremy Crawford and Mike Merles. The main 2 were Jeremy Crawford and Mike Merles. They brought these people on. Those people brought their friends on, and people who were good at game design and a playtesting crew. And they tried to make a good game. And they succeeded. 5e is potentially the most popular and profitable edition of D&D. I don't know for sure on the numbers on that one. It's possible 3.5 beats it out based on sheer book sales, but likely not because D&D Beyond subscriptions are a thing. Mm-hmm. And D&D's just, there are more players now. Like I said,
more players now than there were when 3.5 dropped.
Correct. Now, 5e is a mixed bag, and I'm going to go over...
This one doesn't have the Almond Joys.
A number of things. It does have the Almond Joys.
It does it? Okay.
5e is a mixed bag. The number one part of 5e that's confusing if you look at it from a perspective of older editions of D&D is 5e has a very hands-off approach to the rules. Basically, fun trumps rules. Rule of cool is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, for Christ's sake. In 3.5, there was a table for everything. If you wanted to know how long a player could hold their breath while tied up, there's a literal table you can roll on with different modifiers for different effects that could be hitting the player simultaneously.
Very cool.
5e, fuck that. You can hold your breath equal to your con mod times 10. I don't give a shit. You can be a Navy SEAL if you want. 5e just barely has rules for niche circumstances, and when there are rules, it usually always favors the players in the most ridiculous ways. Riding a horse used to be a thing that took training and skill to do.
Now you can just kind of fucking do it.
And there used to be different proficiencies for different animals you could ride.
Generally putting it, players in 5e are a little bit OP.
Well, I mean, it's just fun trumps the rules, and the players are the ones who need to be having fun, so whatever the rules are, make sure the players are having fun with it. Fun beats the rules. End of story. Next, Advantage and Disadvantage is a system they added to the game instead of 3rd edition's modifiers. Basically, 3rd edition and 4th edition, and 3.5, obviously, they all had modifiers that you would add to things. So, like, if you were flanking, you'd get a +2 to attack. Or if you were doing this, you'd get a plus so much to attack. Or if you were trying to make this skill check, you would get plus this, plus this, plus this, and if someone's helping you, you'd get to add this bonus. It got very crunchy, and people didn't like that about 3.5. Some people do, most people didn't. 4th edition basically didn't have an out-of-combat system, and when it did, it was this weird flowchart, skill-checky thingy.
Gaming moment.
5e overhauled both systems and just replaced it with Advantage and Disadvantage, meaning if you were at all favored in a situation, even a little bit, you're twice as likely to succeed. And if there are crippling, terrible, awful things happening to you, you're twice as likely to fail. I checked it. Advantage happens twice as often as Disadvantage does in the effects and rules of the base 5e game. So you'll encounter Advantage way more often than you will Disadvantage unless your DM's a dick. Sorry, I'm a dick.
I know. Kidding. To fellow viewers, that was a joke.
To fellow viewers, it was a joke. I used to be more of a dick as a DM. I've improved.
Factual.
But it's very much... You lose a ton when you do that. Mm-hmm. It's almost as big as an overhaul as the D20 system, but it's not quite as flashy as a D20 is for everything. It's just, they took so many rules and nuances and different modifiers out of the game for just, you're either twice as likely to succeed or fail at something.
They simplified it, because new people.
They simplified it, because new people. This is a trend. Also...
We've been seeing this since first edition. For better or worse.
Arguably, 2nd edition and 3rd edition and 3.5 edition all made the game more complicated. 4th edition made a completely different game, and then 5th edition came out, and it's a simplified version of 3rd edition.
I mean, yeah.
Also, I'd like to offer my condolences to the friends and family members of the dungeon half of Dungeons & Dragons, as it is very dead in 5th edition. I would like to tell you, not only is the wargame aspect of the game dead, the dungeon is dead in 5e.
It's full-on isekai now.
It's like this. Dungeons used to be huge, sometimes entire campaign-long adventures for the party to go on.
Sometimes the campaign was literally just the dungeon.
For sure. People have mixed opinions on this, but the game distanced itself further and further from the dungeon. In 4th edition, it was mini dungeons and very, I'm gonna say, high combat, high risk encounters. And in 5th edition, the dungeons are the entire campaign, kind of, not really. Exploration is a mechanic, dungeon delving is a mechanic, checking for traps, dealing with traps, surviving in a dungeon. They're all things that have been kind of trivialized. In fact, even traps in general have been so de-nuanced and nerfed, they're barely a mechanic in 5e. Like, the section for traps in the DMG, which is, by the way, half player stuff, is so small and gives you, like, 2 examples for what a trap could possibly do. It details falling damage and obstacle damage. Obstacle damage scales with the character's level, which doesn't make any fucking sense.
No, it doesn't.
And
the same boulder, when you're higher level, will deal way more damage.
for sure.
What? the rock leveled up with you.
Yeah. It's a little stupid. The dungeon is very dead in 5e. The dungeon's half of Dungeons and Dragons is not a thing. If there was a popularity boom for D&D in the 90s and for 3rd edition, 5e is the popularity nuke. There are so many new players. It's becoming a normie activity.
Tommy, are we the normies now?
Probably. Normie's kind of a cringy term, but I'm going to use it for purposes of describing the kind of person I'm mentioning. Like, a normie isn't necessarily a bad person. They're just not someone who's super involved in any given community. They're sort of just a regular guy. And when regular dudes show up to play D&D, I'm allowed to be like, that's kind of weird. This used to be reserved for incredibly nerdy dudes.
It's not a niche thing anymore. It's not the niche for nerdy guys.
That is correct. In fact, nerdy guys are no longer the market. The market is everyone.
Mm-hmm. Everyone can play D&D. Your grandma, your dog.
Honestly, I think everyone should. I like that there are so many people playing D&D.
Indeed.
But also, the increase of normies means that the system needs to be easier to understand.
Right.
Which brings me to my next point, and one I have... It's probably going to open a huge discussion with you if I'm being completely honest.
Okay, let's go.
Is 5e shallow or streamlined?
Shallow or streamlined? Definitely streamlined.
Shallow.
Boy, here we go.
The rule system is so unnuanced. When you look at even first edition Dungeons and Dragons, everything about any given system has so much detail and care put into it. And 5e has feats that reference mechanics that aren't in the DMG or even referenced. What the fuck is a passive insight? The Perceptive's feat references passive insight, which is a rule that never made it out of playtesting. It's just there in the player's handbook, mentioned in a feat. Doesn't mean anything, doesn't do anything. It's just there. Congrats, you are now a character with a passive insight, a mechanic that doesn't matter. The spells have all been downgraded in potentially what they can do. The out-of-combat spells have been considerably nerfed, so there's way less fun you can have with the rules and magic outside of combat. There's way more fun to be had in combat, but that's because combat is so much fucking easier now. It's way less deadly than it used to be. Characters have to fail 3 separate checks to die. And that's if they don't succeed 3 checks first. The average combat encounter is over on turn 6. So you get downed on turn 1, you might still survive until the end of combat. You probably will. Odds are in your favor that you'll be unconscious or awake.
See, I agree to an extent that it's shallow, but it's also streamlined for the new player. It's both.
If you're getting into D&D for the first time, I would recommend getting into 5e.
5e is very new player friendly, but it is not the perfect system. For complexity and the hardcore D&D player, it is not the best system. But however, it's also the most popular. So it can be kind of hard unless you have a group that understands the older systems and actively wants to play them, that it makes it difficult to jump out of 5e.
Popularity is a good thing.
5e is cool, but there are gripes about it, like how simple certain things are. So
popularity is a good thing most of the time.
Popularity is a good thing, but
But
not
too
everyone's
much
gonna...
of it, kills any given hobby.
I know. That's what I'm saying here. It just...
It's just hamburger. I'm of the opinion that 5e is the shallowest we've seen a D&D edition ever. It is the least complex edition of D&D ever. And I mean, it's still fun to play.
But the thing is, like, I'm just saying it because I've DM'd a couple times. New players still don't get even 5e. I mean, honestly, I'm glad the system exists, but it's only for new players. If anything, if you said you wanted to run, like, 3.5 sometime, let me know.
You would be down. No one else would.
That's
Because
the problem.
5e is the most...
5e is
5e is the easiest to understand, and it's
easiest to
the
understand.
most popular one.
The word I'm looking for is convenient.
Convenient.
It is convenient. The other editions have depth, and they're really cool, but they are not convenient.
5e is
Everyone knows
convenient.
5e. Not
Advantage,
everyone knows.
disadvantage, convenient.
Mm-hmm.
Player's handbook, convenient. Feats that reference mechanics that don't exist, convenient.
That's just stupid. That's not convenient, Tommy.
Rules that contradict each other and don't make any sense, but you're encouraged to ignore for fun of the game, convenient.
Like,
Oh.
I like 5th edition for certain things. Mainly, like, the flavor.
I hate the flavor of 5e, actually. It exists in a weird...
Here, let me put it this way. More like, the art style. The overall art style.
It's the worst in any edition of D&D, and I will stand by that.
Okay, this is where we're going to disagree.
Well,
I'm sorry.
okay, actually, 2nd edition had some of the worst art. 1st edition, I kind of have a lot of respect for because Gygax did like half of it, and they had like $2 in art commission.
Damn.
So, like, there's an amount of respect for early D&D
Kind
art.
of like the equivalent of an indie dev project on, like, Steam. It's like, it kind of looks ass, but you know what? The one guy did it.
A lot of 2nd
him some
edition
credit
art
on
is
that.
just really shitty. But 3rd, 3.5, 4th edition art all knocks it out of the fucking park. I prefer those illustrations almost exclusively to anything that we've seen in 5e.
I don't know. I like the 5e illustrations in all the books, honestly. I think they're pretty cool.
I
That's
think it's
just...
because they're the first books you read. I feel like if I sat you down
I'm sorry,
and showed you the
4th
Monster
edition
Vault,
books kind of look ugly.
I don't think you've looked through enough of any 4th edition book to even make that comment.
Considering...
You've
hey,
seen the cover of 2.
firsthand, I've read very briefly the 4th edition Player's Handbook like twice. Briefly, like page through it. Confidently can say I'm not a fan of the art direction.
I don't know. 5e, let me put it this way. 5e monsters and characters exist in an empty void. Every other edition has some background shit going on. 5e monsters are just technically drawn wrong. Like, it mentions goblins usually have greenish skin, and then the goblin we see in the fucking book is, like, puke yellow. It's like, what the fuck is going on here?
I'm not saying all of it is good or accurate, but I think it looks cool.
They're floating RPG sprites in a void, which is about as complex as those stat blocks they represent, so I guess they've got it going for them there.
God. Okay, now you're roasting it. Here, let me get... I've got some books here. I'm away from the microphone. You guys get some depth on the background now. Okay, let's pull this out.
He's pulling out D&D books.
Okay, I've got the DMG here. That's your boy, Acererak. That looks cool as shit.
Okay, first of all, this might just be called the player's loot guide for how, like, much...
Okay, we've already talked about that. We don't need to give shit on the inside of the book. I'm talking about the art in it.
There's... Okay, there's several cool pieces of art in the book.
Yeah, you're starting to warm up to it.
I'm not. I like the other art better. I gotta say, 5e...
We're gonna stay split on this, I'm sorry.
This chick has a laser beam.
Okay, hold on. Let me actually go back to that one.
Nope. Here you go. There's a
Okay.
section about firearms. She's using the laser beam firearm.
Why is there a laser beam firearm?
It's a reference to an old D&D adventure from 2nd edition where they go into a crashed spaceship.
You know, I just looked at the Eberron cover. How about we just not talk about this segment anymore?
We cannot talk about the art style anymore.
I like the 5e art style, and I don't exactly have a concrete way of explaining why. I just do.
I'm gonna call it nostalgia and it being your first exposure to D&D art.
Okay.
Okay, so
Continue.
want to talk about the original license agreement controversy while we're here?
The OGL?
Yeah, the OGL.
Sure.
So
I thought we weren't talking about business, though.
we're not. This is a short segment, but it's worth mentioning as it's a huge blip on 5e's history.
Okay.
Basically, Wizards of the Coast has always had an original license agreement for all of their editions of D&D. Even 4th edition, if you wanted to publish homebrew content for 4e.
However, at some point, they didn't.
No.
They tried not to.
They tried to say they weren't going to make it. They weren't going to renew it.
They
So
were going to
basically, the
unexist
OGL
it.
would fall off for 5e, and they would retroactively take income from anyone who published any content for 5e, and they were going to make it so going forward, you would need express permission from Wizards of the Coast, and they would get an express percentage of the revenue from any content you published that was meant to be used for 5e and any edition of D&D onward.
Basically, filthy capitalism.
Well, not only that, but it would actively ruin several businesses that have made D&D 5e so popular.
They shoot themselves in the foot, and they make themselves look bad.
This was met by boycotting and basically universal protest and fuck yous from the community. Not a single person reacted positively to the OGL.
And so they pressed Control-Z, and they
Yeah.
undid it.
They basically decided they were going to renew it and continue to renew it in perpetuity because of how violently everyone responded to the idea of robbing creators of their money. Interestingly enough, now that you know a little bit more about D&D's history, imagine if Chainmail revoked its OGL in heavy air quotes right when Gygax was trying to make D&D.
I wonder where we would be then.
We wouldn't have D&D. Oddly enough, homebrewing has always kind of steered the ship. The ship's always been owned by someone, but which direction the ship's going is kind of been decided by the community. People liked more player-driven narratives, which led to 3rd edition making more powerful player characters and giving more opportunities for roleplay. People liked power gaming, which led to the horrible apocalypse that was 4th edition. The community kind of always decides where D&D's going, just not when it gets there or why, which is why sometimes there's controversies or boycotts. But how homebrew's going and what the community feedback is kind of seems to steer where things are going. The OGL being a huge reason for this. I honestly think D&D wouldn't be anywhere near as successful or prolific as it is without the OGL, because, as we talked...
It protects creators, and creators are literally, like, the driving factor for
well,
the game.
The magazines published by D&D were also published by third parties for D&D.
Those wouldn't happen if the OGL was removed. So.
And a number of those magazines made up a huge swath of D&D's lore over the years.
The
And monsters.
Simply put, the butterfly effect would be absolutely catastrophic.
It's, yeah. The OGL is something very minor, but I'd love to talk about it more.
Maybe minor in terms of us discussing D&D history, but it
Major to the effects of D&D as a
major.
whole.
Like, it could have been bad.
The next thing I'd like to talk about in regards to 5e is D&D Beyond. This is our
Beyond,
sponsored
everyone.
segment.
No, it's
D&D
not.
Beyond is paying us zero money for no sponsorships.
I would
Thank
rather
you,
not
D&D
get-
Beyond.
I would rather not get sponsored by D&D Beyond.
Fair enough.
Can we ask them to, like, pay
Interest-
us unlimited money to sponsor them? Like,
I'd
I'm
take
sh-
$10.
I would take 5.
I'd take 2.
I think they could talk me down.
They could talk me down. Anywho, did you know 4e had a beta version of D&D Beyond? that was
Really?
actually better than D&D Beyond is now.
How so?
You could make 3D models of your character in the character sheet version of 4E D&D
It's
Beyond.
cool as fuck. So Hero Forge.
No, it had 3D video game style models for your character that you could customize like it was in Skyrim or some shit.
That's actually cool as fuck.
Alongside that,
Why doesn't that exist now?
It kept track of all of your abilities, and if you like plugged in conditions and whatnot, it would tell you the actions you could take on your turn.
Okay.
So there were like computers designed to keep track of what your character was capable of doing, why, and for how long. And D&D Beyond is a strictly worse version of that. But it was functional on launch, which the 4th edition version wasn't. So there's that, I suppose. I don't know. D&D Beyond, you're kind of paying for a character sheet.
It's just a money trap.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, you need to unlock, like, to use any of, like, the module stuff, you basically get, like, a trial of, like, you can make some level 1 character sheets, and then if you want to level them up, you have to buy the modules online. And they aren't marked down by a lot. Like, you're paying $30 for a fucking link on your D&D Beyond account. Do you know how much it costs to get all of the content? You know how much it takes to get a full access account? It's like $550.
Which
last
is
I checked.
More than it costs to buy all the books.
I don't know about that.
It is. Count the books. There's like, what, 16 books? And they're $50 each?
Something like that.
That's $320 plus tax. So if it's $500, it literally costs less to buy all the books than to have a full access D&D account.
I looked it up like a year ago, and that's what I remember. It might be marked down.
Fair enough. I didn't actually do a whole lot of research into D&D Beyond. I just wanted to mention the 4E beta for D&D Beyond was actually better than D&D Beyond.
Do you want me to do
now.
a live check? I could check on my phone.
Nah,
okay. Guys, just don't buy D&D Beyond. You will pay way too much for digital copies.
Well,
Go buy the real books.
A lot of people really like D&D Beyond as a character sheet tracker. To which I'd say there are free ones on the App Store that do better.
You could just print them, or you could just, you could just download a free file and then like turn it into a Word document or something. I don't know. There are easier ways to do it than paying the exorbitant fee that is D&D Beyond.
Okay. It's hard to talk about 5e without talking about the elephant in the room.
There's
the
one
large, voice actor-filled elephant in the room. Critical Role and D&D streams blew the fuck up. Critical Role is a multi-million-dollar brand. They make close to $1 million every stream. And they do one every Thursday.
Tommy, can we do that sometime? I want to make some millions of dollars.
We would need
every
cameras and voice actor talent, and to not be cringy as fuck when we're playing D&D.
I think I can do everything but that last one, honestly.
Critical Role is just huge, alongside a bunch of other D&D streams. It's amazing to think that we're watching people play a role-playing game for hours on end, and there's enough people that it's $1 million brand. They have an animated series.
It's big. It's really big. I wish our campaign was that big, but it also shows just how devoted people are to, this game.
Yeah, there are a lot of people very invested in D&D as a game.
And not specifically to these creators. They care about their stories as probably sometimes more, depending on the situation, than making their own. Some people just don't have the time or the people with the time to play D&D. So to substitute it, they'll listen to people on the web.
Also, they're professional actors too.
So they kind of juice it up a little bit.
Their sessions are just better than anyone else's could possibly be.
I'd like to think our sessions go pretty well, but they are nowhere near comparing to Critical Role.
Our best sessions are maybe comparable to half their worst sessions,
I want to disagree, but yeah, honestly, they are so good.
Anywho, I'd like to reconcile D&D as a mainstream hobby. How do you reconcile that? What's your personal philosophies that help you cope with the fact that it's a mainstream hobby now?
The way D&D is played is entirely based around the group that plays it. So no matter how mainstream it becomes, it will always be our version of D&D. We might play the same edition as the normie people. We might play 5th edition, but how we play it is going to be completely different from every other group. We play with rules that not everyone else plays with.
Fair play.
We have people in our group that like to play different archetypes, different characters, stuff like that. I mean, D&D to an extent it's just based off of the way you play. Our D&D is very different from the next group's D&D and that group's D&D and all that. So even if it's normie, it's our version isn't normie. You know what I mean?
I hear that. Personally, my philosophy is a little different, but I do really agree with most of what you said there. That makes a lot of sense. My personal way to reconcile it as a mainstream hobby is normally things don't get worse because more people are doing them. Like if you look at it this way, chess, painting, video games, they're all huge and things are becoming bigger by the year. People have a lot of free time. It's becoming more socially acceptable to be into like weird nerdy things because childhood lasts longer these days.
Yeah.
I think it's completely normal that there are things like D&D, like Magic, like a bunch of things I really love that used to be nerdy and kind of niche that are becoming available to a more wide and mainstream audience. Just because people have the free time and the money for it. I think D&D is a great way to find community. D&D is a great way to form memories and ongoing bonds with people.
D&D is a social game at the end of the day.
I would recommend it to anyone who thinks they can stomach the sheer nerdiness that it is, which seems like way more people than anyone ever thought was possible. And I think that so long as the quote-unquote normies in the community don't make us as cringy as Fortnite, at the end of the day, D&D can handle even twice as many players as it has now without becoming sort of a depraved and cringy pool of players.
Mm-hmm. Also, because it is so mainstream, it's also very accessible.
And there's also a lot of homebrew content. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of people that wouldn't have normally made anything for D&D that do now, including romance authors and like
horror
professional game designers, horror writers. Mm-hmm. There's so many different kinds of people,
stories to play around. Like mm-hmm. it's really cool.
Except for low magic.
Except for low magic, that will never happen
because that was killed in 3.5 and buried in 5th. Holy fuck, was low magic ending. Buried in 5th?
It was. But another point I was getting to, as it is accessible, you also have to think it's pretty easy to just find a group. Maybe in your close-knit group of friends, not everyone is interested, not everyone has the time to play, but you could probably just go to a game store or even just look stuff up on the web, and you can just find a group. Really easy way to make new friends.
There's so many Discord servers dedicated to D&D.
No, yeah, for like the socially inept, it can be a bit of a hard barrier to break, but it's a way easier than it probably was back in the 90s.
Oh,
right?
For sure. So, and also, if you're socially inept, I'd recommend you go play D&D because you'll be less socially inept afterwards.
It turns out when you play D&D, you kind of have to do some talking, and it makes you a little bit better at it.
Mm-hmm. 5e did do some things that I'm okay with. One of the things that D&D did that I will praise it for to the end of the fucking edition, to the end of the decade, I will praise it up and down the halls as loud as I need to for this. You know what 5e did that D&D players have been asking for Dungeons & Dragons to do for actual decades? That's such an improvement to the game.
What?
They stopped overpublishing, and they started putting in quality control.
This is epic.
Now, yes, there's less books now, and those books are way more curated now, but also there's not, like,
There's not
30
books filled
books.
with chaff.
Exactly. There's quality control, and books are way better paced and way more impactful when they come out. Now, there are some downsides to it, and there are some things I disagree with. Like, every campaign setting also has to have archetypes and races now, so there's no DM books anymore. It's all just stuff players use to break the game, and sometimes some stat blocks monsters that DMs can kind of play around with, but usually a new book is just to sell the latest archetype to the new players.
Maybe if Mr. D&D hears this, maybe release another DM book. It would be pretty cool.
It would be great to have just one book designed for DMs.
Advanced DM guide.
Anything. But yeah, no, 5e deserves to be praised for that. I'm glad they did that. We'll talk about some stuff later on, but that's not 5e's problem or fault, and it won't be part of 5e. So for now, 5e full on deserves all the praise in the world for not overpublishing.
Mm-hmm.
I do have one complaint I'd like to make about 5e before we move on to the next topic of this episode, and that is 5e has decided to become it's less like a fantasy novel and way more like a fantasy manga now. Sort of everyone has magic. The main characters are kind of unkillable for basically no in-canon reason.
To an extent. Okay. Here's the thing. It can be more fun that way, but I can see why as the DM it isn't.
Well, it's not, strictly speaking, as a DM. It's like, I really love the gritty, low magic settings that, like, first edition takes place in.
But I'm talking
and
about,
I like the rule set that comes into place in, like, 3.5 and, some of 5th's rule set. But, like, holy shit, does it cheapen the experience when you're just unkillable at level 1.
So basically, you don't like the idea that the stakes are really low. Like, going into the first encounter, there's a pretty good chance you don't die.
The stakes are really low, and the powers are cheaper. Powers used to come at some kind of a cost. Like, the kits I talked about always came with a negative alongside the positives. Like, paladins can't break their oath to holiness in the original paladin kit, or they just lose their paladin powers and they become a shitty fighter. In 5e, it talks about maybe that happens, but it doesn't give you any rules or lay down any express ways a paladin could break their oath. Power comes at no cost. It comes really early, and players are just really strong, very hard to kill, very much anime protagonists instead of disposable mercenaries.
I think that has to do with how people want their stories to be curated. I could understand why some people don't want to play as disposable mercenaries, because developing a character and a background for said character is very cool, and when death feels like it's right around the corner, it can be a bit hard to be very welcome to that idea.
Hear me out, though. There's got to be a better balance than you're just an unkillable god starting at level 5.
I mean, I agree with that, but like, how do you think you would get to that middle line? Like, where you don't want to fall into killing characters repeatedly and constantly, but you don't want to fall into literally making an isekai where the characters are going to beat all of their goals by the end of the show, and it's like, you guys did it, you are D1 or whatever,
I think if player death was about twice as likely as it is in 5e now, it would strike a better balance. And I think it would be cooler if powers they came at some kind of a cost, or there were more rules and nuances to how the different classes got to be so powerful. It would feel less like a departure from any kind of like hardcore fantasy as a whole, and just a transition into, you guys are anime characters now.
Okay, yeah, I feel that.
Also, it would encourage me as like a DM to give more magic items to my players too if I felt like they were not doing the greatest in combat or whatnot. Like, the DM can always make the players more powerful, but the DM can't really nerf the players. Because you kind of expect to be able to get the features that are on your proficiency table when you make a character.
Right.
So 5e being very heavy on low-level player characters being very powerful, and late game kind of leveling up for hit points and spell slots and not much else. You're encouraged to multi-class early, you're encouraged to break the game fast, and you're encouraged to have a very, very powerful character, and you kind of expect to be able to get whatever's on that proficiency table unless the DM tells you you won't get this at the very start of the campaign. So, like, as a DM, I can't really nerf players. I can't make them less anime protagonisty. I can't sit down to play 5e and be like, okay, guys, I want to run a low magic campaign. I'm only allowing one spellcaster in the party, and I'd like you guys to all roll non-magic characters. You know what I would get? I can tell you exactly what I would get. I would get a party that consists of probably multiple fighters, a barbarian, and a rogue, and then one person who's either a cleric or a wizard to try and heal the party up. Mm-hmm. That's not even the OG4. It's like, here, name one class in 5e that doesn't cast spells as an archetype option.
So about that.
Are you telling me that there's no purely non-magical class?
Not that I know of, nope.
We have wild magic barbarians, for Christ's sake.
Yep.
Bards cast spells. Artificers, the new class, they're half casters. Fighters have Eldritch Knight options, as well as Cyanite and Echo Knight, which are
Rogues
magical,
have
and
Arcane Trickster,
as well as Soul Knives and the Phantom, which are magical in nature.
Yep.
Rangers are full-on half casters now, alongside Paladins.
There's not a single class that is fully detached from magic.
For sure, you have to ban specific specializations, not classes, if you want to run low magic.
Yep.
Like, they've killed a lot of potential to make any kind of gritty or grounded experience with just sheer power creep and trying to sell very creative and inventive subclasses rather than having classes that are functional and cool. Like, what happened to the outlaw or the mercenary or
Honestly, it is kind of upsetting because
just a dude.
Thinking about the classes and stuff, at that point, if you wanted to run low magic, you'd almost have to play a different setting.
You almost have to play a different edition.
I know, that's what I'm saying. You have to, like, either a different edition or a different game altogether.
Mm-hmm. And it's sad because the whole sword and sorcery, low magic D&D setting, that's what D&D is. That's a huge part of its identity. Other settings did high magic. D&D was originally very grounded, very hard magic, it's hard to get access to the hard magic. And now sort of everyone can do anything. It's a lot like the issue with 4th edition, except not quite as prevalent. It's not like every class can be a healer or a tank now. It's just like half the classes have access to 75% of the roles.
Yeah.
So you can't be a support barbarian, but you can do everything else as a barbarian. And you can't quite be a support fighter, but you can do everything else as a fighter. There are tank wizards and all kinds of other things. It's a little redunculous, don't you think?
Just a little.
All right. Well, that's enough about 5e. Let's talk about the future.
All right. Sounds good.
So, what do you know about 1D&D?
1D&D? Nothing, honestly. I haven't looked into it. I just heard about it. I heard about some of the things they were doing. It sounds bad.
Okay, so it's the playtest for 6th edition.
Right.
They're releasing it to the public in hopes that the public will break it and they'll be able to fix it. A lot of the decisions they've made for 1D&D I really don't like. Like the removal of race as a reference point at all.
I was actually going to bring that up.
It's species now?
Species.
I don't know. They, at the one hand, they're trying not to be insensitive to other people's cultures, which I can understand.
They're trying to be woke. It's race. Like,
I feel like you should be able to say race, and I feel like it's
not like it's offensive in any sense.
it's fine to reference that there are different humanoid creatures in this
They're
setting.
different humanoid creatures. They are humanoid. They're different races. They aren't different species.
I mean, the difference between a cobalt and a human can't breed, so evidently they're different
They are
species.
a different species, but like
It still works. It's just it feels like a very
is an elf a different species? Because they can breed with
no.
humans.
It's probably
Is a halfling a different species?
it's hard to heads or tails it. I think changing the term is stupid just because it feels like an empty gesture. It feels like here we're changing the term. We are also okay, it feels like an empty gesture that hurts the game because in addition to that, they're letting you fuck around with the ability scores. So how it worked is the assumption used to be if you're a half orc, you're just stronger than most people. Orcs are stronger than basically every other humanoid race because they're strong at birth. They have like double muscle, or they're born with steroids in their veins, or whatever the in-canon explanation is. Orcs are just stronger than most things. Mm-hmm. So if you're a half orc, you're stronger than most things.
Yep. They are juiced up from birth.
You can now, based on how your character was raised, place those ability score improvements anywhere. So because of a half orc, you can be smart.
That's stupid as fuck. Straight up.
It defeats a lot of nuance from the game, and now you just pick the races that have the best abilities, with that, like best triggered or casting abilities, and just ignore the ability score improvements because you can fit them wherever you want. Which actually used to balance things a lot. Because a race that gets a bonus to Constitution is just generally worse because Constitution's the only stat you can't attack with. So it's worse as a racial increase. So you can make that race that gives bonuses to Constitution stronger in other ways. From a game balance perspective, from an in-lore and universe perspective, it used to feel really cool that, like, dwarves had resistance to poison and a high constitution, and that is neat. And 1D&D is taking so much nuance away from the conversation, but just saying, hey, any race can do anything now. We're not adding any penalties. We are full-on abandoning the idea that what you're born as or how tall you are has any effect on any of your character's stats.
Yeah, I don't jive with that, honestly. It doesn't make sense. That like breaks the entire idea of a background to like these races had to develop in their own areas, right? Mm-hmm. Through their own conflicts, through their own ability to survive based off of the environment they were in and such and such. That just completely removes that.
It's really not.
Dwarves are hardy because they live in the mountains.
No, they're not. They can be intelligent now.
Stupid as fuck.
Or wise. Or charismatic.
That takes away from the thing we were arguing about earlier, too, where there should be punishment for mixing and matching things that don't exactly work, but building off of those and it being more fun.
Yeah.
Now, that's gone with 1D&D.
Yeah, you can't play against the stereotype because you get the same benefits for playing the stereotype as playing against the stereotype.
You have to actively like tune the stereotype to be bad, and that's stupid as fuck. It should just be bad from the start so that it's cool.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just intentionally nerfing yourself without it being unique. You're just actively choosing to... It's like actively, intentionally misplaying.
A lot of the classes in 1D&D have also been released, and they've been consistently made more powerful across the board, except the Warlock, because fuck the Warlock, due to something I'd like to call power creep. Mm-hmm. So when you compare 6th edition to 5th edition, characters are even more powerful at level 1, and even more powerful in the first 3 levels. And there's even less to award your characters with past level 7 or so. It becomes very front-heavy as far as character development goes, and I'm not a fan. I like it when games are designed to last longer than, the first quarter of a proficiency table.
Yeah.
Also, it encourages multiclassing, which is like the biggest issue with 5e. Is multiclassing doesn't come at a cost. You can just kind of do it, and you should do it anyway to, make your character better at what they
Multiclassing,
do.
at least from a roleplay perspective, always kind of seemed lame unless the character had a reason to, and even then, like, I don't see any reason why any character should multiclass past two different classes unless you're playing a gimmick character, and those kind of fall flat anyway because they're gimmick characters.
I kind of like multiclassing 3 character classes sometimes. Just because sometimes characters develop in strange ways. Like I played a warlock paladin bard once.
Okay, how'd that go?
Well, the idea
Was it OP?
No. I'm sure there's a way to do that would make it OP, but that wasn't my intention. The idea, for the most part, was... how did he start off? He started off as a traveling musician who, fell in cahoots with a mercenary company and was frustrated that he wasn't powerful enough to actually do anything with the mercenary community. Like, he wasn't a benefit to any of them. He was just sort of entertainment. So he made a warlock pact so he could become more powerful, and he accidentally brought a lot of terrible things about in his search for power, and as a redemption arc, he swore a holy oath. So he had 3 classes he had leveled in that were, completely organic with one another. And in-game, it was always I was confronted with too many options because he had taken a lot of early level dips. But from a lore and flavor perspective, it all made a perfect amount of sense.
Yeah, that's fair. I like it when it ties into the roleplay, but I don't feel like a character should just randomly multi-class into something else.
Just because it makes them more powerful?
Yeah, just solely because of that. Though I feel like, honestly, there isn't a good way to exactly balance that. In terms of rules, I think it just comes down to the DM. So maybe if the DM doesn't see it as being exactly a good reason for a character to do that, maybe they could impose some sort of debuff themselves.
Well, a DM can always say no. Multiclassing is an optional rule, and it does say in the book, with your express permission, but that's another huge part of players feeling very entitled to what they see in the book.
To an extent, all the points we've made about the past editions can kind of be wiped under the rug because of that, but the rules they provide should still be pretty grounded and solid.
For sure.
So
it's not on the DM to make the game balanced. The game should already exist in a state where it feels balanced and it feels fair if you just make a character and sort of go with how the tides of roleplay take.
Right.
So 6th edition has been confirmed. 6th edition is happening. That's what 1D&D is about. We are for sure doing a 6th edition.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about 6th edition?
I really don't know how it's going to go because 5th edition kind of feels like it is quote unquote the edition.
Mm-hmm.
It's mainstream. It's the edition that made D&D mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what 6th edition is actually trying to do. I'm waiting to see what it becomes.
Do you want to hear some behind the scenes stuff?
Sure.
So Wizards of
Let
the
us know
Coast
back.
is hemorrhaging money at the moment, and that is why Magic the Gathering has had so many more sets than it normally has, and why the overall quality of the game has gone downhill. And D&D being their most recognized property, but also one of their least profitable properties, they have decided that 6th edition needs to be more profitable, which is sort of why we've seen a change in edition every time there's been a new edition of D&D. We need to make more money. We need to make more money. We need to make more money.
Capitalism.
Interestingly enough, I would say pride comes before the fall, and the person they've put in charge and hired on as the reason they're making 6th edition ran a mobile game company before
This already don't sound good.
and has talked about putting microtransactions in.
Tommy, I don't think we're going past 5th.
There's
We aren't.
some argument to say that that's online rumors and hearsay, but her track record isn't great. I don't know. The Wizards of the Coast, what we know for sure is 6th edition is confirmed. We know some of the mechanics that are going to feature, and it's going to look like improved 5th edition and power crept 5th edition is what the character classes will look like. We know that they're abandoning the concept of race for the concept of species, and we know that you're basically allowed to just go willy-nilly with wherever you want your ability score improvements.
Uh-huh.
And we also know that Wizards of the Coast has decided that they need to make more money on D&D.
That's
So it's
the part that really scares me. Like, I don't want to say anything about it because I have a feeling that dubious little sentence is going to absolutely ruin it in some way.
Mm-hmm.
That's why my opinion isn't really there. On the mechanics, overall, kind of suck so far. Maybe it could be better, but if anything, what does it matter if they monetize it in such an evil way that it's hard to get a hold of all the stuff you may need? I don't... It's a role-playing game with books that were already kind of expensive, but like it didn't feel that bad. I just don't know how they're going to monetize it this time, and it kind of scares me how.
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to make more money off of essentially selling $50 books to people.
Like, what are they going to do? Raise the price of the books? Less people will buy them.
Make the books into pamphlets, so you have to buy the fighter class and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. If they split it up, but then it'll just be, overpublished.
We could see the return of overpublishing. That could be what they're talking about.
Ruin it the same way they did with like 3rd edition, like we talked about earlier.
At least we know we're not going to get a repeat of 4th edition. So the mechanics we'll see in 6th edition will be mostly 5th edition, mostly 3rd edition.
It's meant to be 5th edition, but better.
They're streamlining
also
and power creeping 5th edition, and they're monetizing it better, is what we know for sure.
Overall, the future, at least for 6th edition, does not sound the best.
It looks grim, yes.
But I will hold my hopes, and when it comes out, we might talk about it. Probably will.
I'd be down.
Yeah, we'll be down when it does come out. But for now, I just can't put an opinion on it other than I'm not the most confident in it.
I'd like to talk about 2nd edition Pathfinder, because D&D still has a competitor in those enemies they made in Paizo so long ago.
Mm-hmm.
I say enemies, they're more like business rivals. I don't think there's actually any animosity between the companies.
Of course not.
But, 2E Pathfinder's a thing. It's, in fact, a really clean system. It's just a little over-tactical for our tastes. We played a couple sessions of it, and it was pretty neat.
It is pretty neat. We didn't run it for very long, though.
Yeah.
I think we'd have a better impression and more words to share on it if we did.
For sure. I
thought the system was pretty cool for the time that I did get to play it.
I've read the 3 first books cover to cover, and I was part of the beta playtest. So, like, they released a PDF to the public for beta playtesting, and I was part of that and gave some of my feedback to it, and it was a really cool thing to be a part of. It's kind of like what 1D&D is doing now.
Cool as fuck.
I don't know. Pathfinder's a lot of fun. I think 2nd edition Pathfinder is a very clean and...
Pathfinder 1 was cool. Pathfinder 2 is cool. I think we just need more playtime with it. Maybe see how it is. Maybe it'll pull ahead of... Do you think we'll get a 3E Pathfinder anytime soon?
I really don't think so. Pathfinder's buckled down very hard on 2nd edition.
2nd edition might... I mean, we're still going to probably play 5E, but...
Yeah, 2nd edition, it's very much like fixed 5E in the sense that, like, a lot of the biggest issues with the action economy and the balance and the fact that there's no low magic options are very, very fixed by Pathfinder. But it opens up a whole bunch of new problems, like the system's way less intuitive and way more complicated, and it's way more tactical and...
way less new player friendly.
Way less new player friendly. Also, resting works differently. Rules is written, so that's what killed my first and only campaign with Pathfinder. Was the first time the players took a long rest and restored only their Constitution modifier HP.
They kind of exploded,
and then we never played again.
Yeah, maybe that needs fixing.
I would like to mention that the D&D community, at the very least, seems to be very stalwart. So if 6th edition is monetized horribly, the community's big enough and had such a come together moment and such like a big
they already fought off the OGL. I'm sure they could make a difference on 6th edition if it turns out to be bad.
For sure. I want to say that the community at the very least will hold us together even if 6th edition is as bad or worse as 4th. I think D&D is not going anywhere anytime soon, but who can say? Do you have any more thoughts on the future of D&D?
Like I said, it's the future, not that great, but what we already have is really cool. And I like everything that we've gotten so far, even 4th edition.
Really? I brought you around on 4th edition?
Not exactly.
Oh.
But there's
I
something,
also kind of hate 4th edition, but there's some stuff that's good.
It's very love-hate.
It's very
I
hate, love.
Like, it's like an 80 to 20 ratio. You remember the Milk Dud and, like, Crunch thing?
With the razor blade that has Spell Plague engraved on it?
Yeah, that's 4th edition. We already talked about that.
Yeah.
But hey, there's a Crunch bar in that sea of Milk Duds.
The Milk Duds are good, too. They're just kind of duds.
They're kind of duds. Anything else on that?
No, I think I'm good.
Cool.
Let us know if you like this kind of episode more than what we normally do.
Yeah, we've got this funny thing on Spotify called the poll. Let us know what you thought of this very, very different episode compared to our normal content. And
also, before we go, I'd like to give a hint on our next research episode. It'll be episode 22.
It'll be episode 22.
And 22 is significant to the topic.
It is significant to the topic.
If
I'll let
any
you guys...
of you guess, based solely on the number 22, who we're talking about, I will pay you $22.
Swedish guy, tell me. You know. You probably don't, but you know.
You know.
22nd episode, 22, ring a bell. Anyways, comment it in the description, and if I get the answer before episode 22 is released, you get $22. That is a given promise. In fact, I'm
shaking the shut the fuck. I have to cut out that you shook the mic now, because that is so god awful to listen to.
Honestly, it looks pretty bad on Audacity. Okay, let's close this out.
All right.
I'm Communications,
and I'm a maniac.
This has been Complimentary Mania. Thank you for listening to the documentary episode.
Bye.
Bye bye.